Hello, you're listening to the Eric McKenna Project.
Jim, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Eric. This is awesome.
Yeah, I'm flattered and I'm excited. This is one of the shows that I've been looking at directly on the calendar, and I was very much interested in getting you in here and further either blowing my mind or expanding my mind, one of the two, maybe a little of both today. But for the listeners and the viewers, give us the 10-second story here on your bio.
Sure. My name is Jim Krug. I serve as the planetarium director of the Neil Armstrong Planetarium in Altoona, PA. It's part of Altoona Area High School. I've held the position for the past 17 years. The planetarium
started when he was 7.
Yeah. But the planetarium is kind of neat. It was built in 1972, right at the tail end of the Apollo missions, because a lot of people don't know the federal government gave huge grants to schools all across the country to build these planetariums, because the idea was if we get young men and women interested in the space race, they will then grow to adults and support NASA. Mm-hmm. So a lot of these places have closed, but we're still going since 72. And then over the last 5 years, a history teacher colleague and I started a museum to the space race outside of our planetarium. And we've got some really awesome artifacts. We've got signatures from astronauts, Soviet cosmonauts.
Wow.
We've got amazing artifacts from NASA, including astronaut gloves and an unflown tire from one of the Apollo lunar rovers. And really exciting, we have a project going now, Eric, called Apollo 21, where we're actually getting what's called a boiler plate, which was basically a test Apollo capsule that NASA would use to simulate different parts of the mission. Ours in particular was actually used for naval dive recovery. They would drop this thing in the ocean, and Navy dive crews would practice actually fishing this thing out of the water. And there were over 30 of them made by NASA, but less than 10 are left in existence.
Wow.
Some were blown up in the upper atmosphere, some sank, but we're getting one of them. And then I do great things there with students. We have a lot of public outreach. We do scouting groups. Every year now I do a 9-week adult class during the wintertime, where some classes have been about UFOs, some have been about conspiracy, some have been about the Apollo missions. And then lastly, the other big iron I have in the fire is over the last 3 years, we actually built an observatory out at a local Revolutionary War fort that's right outside Altoona. It's called Fort Roberto, and it was a lead mining fort for continental musket balls during the Revolutionary War.
Okay.
And one of the big challenges here, Eric, is you can't just plop a modern observatory beside a Revolutionary War fort.
Right.
So the challenge was, from the outside, it had to look like basically just a little log building. But we designed it so then you push on the back wall, 3 of the walls slide open, and then you've just got modern telescopes inside. So we do like a lot of outreach events for the public. In my spare time, I have a podcast with my 2 teacher colleague buddies, Jason and Brock. It's called Majestic Ears Only.
Right.
And it's certainly not to the level of production and professionalism of this podcast. But it's
we haven't gotten there yet. You may change your mind.
But it's doing pretty well. Listeners can find that on iTunes and a number of different media.
Right.
And then I'm also a state section director for the Mutual UFO Network, so we can talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Let's start with MUFON.
Sure.
I think the public hears MUFON a lot. They generally know what it is, but can you give some background and what is your role in MUFON currently?
Oh, that's a great question. MUFON was actually founded in 1969, and it basically rose from the embers of a forerunner group that's really interesting. It was called NICAP, N-I-C-A-P, and that was the National Investigative Committee of Aerial Phenomenon. And so think back 1950s. This is before UFOs and aliens are really taboo. So NICAP was actually very credible because they had former military involved. They had mainstream physicists involved. This was at a time where science was really openly exploring the possibility of extraterrestrials. Sadly, what happened with NICAP, and this is no longer a conspiracy, this is basically confirmed, is the CIA infiltrated it. Their own agents became members, worked their way up through the leadership, ended up paying themselves exorbitant salaries, and they essentially bankrupted NICAP. And so it's still around today, but basically in name only. So MUFON in 1969 essentially rises from those ashes. It is short for Mutual UFO Network. It is officially a civilian network. It's countrywide and actually worldwide. And basically what would happen, Eric, if somebody had a UFO sighting, they could file it with MUFON's online database. And then wherever they're located, field investigators like myself or my buddy Jason would get assigned the case. We would call them, conduct a phone interview, and then if needed, we can actually go out and visit the site to collect evidence. I will say here in Pennsylvania, if any of our listeners are interested, we are really short on field investigators right now. Like, for example, Jason and I cover such a large area. If there is any UFO sighting from basically the center of Pennsylvania up by the New York state line, the whole way down through the middle to the Mason-Dixon line, either Jason or I is going to get it. So the more help we can have with that, the better.
And how can they contact MUFON? The best way to, if they were interested.
Easiest way to do it is just go right to their website online. It breaks it down state by state, and it shows you contact information for every chapter. And I'll certainly leave my contact information with you if anyone here is interested.
Perfect. So many potential avenues to go down here. So if it's a little bit disjointed, my apologies up front.
No, not at all.
I purposely didn't do much note-taking or preparation for the show because I wanted it to just be very natural and flow well. I wanted it to really be genuine, too. I've been a UFO enthusiast for so long, and I did it in eras when we talked off camera a little bit about when it wasn't cool.
Oh, absolutely.
So the Bob Lazar story will always resonate with me because I kind of feel in a weird way, uniquely I lived it. I watched it unfold from the available media that there was. Bob Lazar's story has been rekindled now. The Jeremy Corbell documentary about him, the appearance on Joe Rogan and so forth. And it seems to be corresponding with a recent announcement by the government that something's coming in the coming days or weeks. Right. So can we talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So for those who maybe don't know a lot about Bob Lazar, he really broke to national prominence in the late 80s, around 1989. There were all these stories about this brilliant physicist that was doing amazing things like making jet-powered rocket cars. And he also started to tell stories to his closer friends about working on non-terrestrial craft, actual extraterrestrial craft. And so a pretty quality journalist from out in Nevada, George Knapp, actually interviews Lazar. And they have a number of phenomenal interviews where Lazar makes some claims that at the time seem pretty outlandish. People hadn't known a lot about Area 51 at the time, the secret government test base for high-end aircraft on the Nellis Air Force Test Range. And Lazar said he actually worked at a special part of Area 51 that was called S4. And at the time, nobody had even heard of S4. And he made claims that they essentially reverse engineered crashed UFOs. So reverse engineering for our listeners essentially means if we're fortunate enough to have something crash from outer space that is well beyond our current capabilities, they would basically take it to sites like Area 51, like the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and scientists, physicists like Lazar would essentially take them apart to try to see how they worked. And so he made claims that it was a technology well beyond what we had, and it was essentially an anti-gravity craft that worked on something he called Element 115, which at the time was very controversial because at the time, the periodic table only went up to uranium, which I think is around Element 92. He also said that these crafts basically worked by amplifying gravity waves, which was also controversial because even though Einstein mentioned the idea of gravity waves way back around 1917 with general relativity, it had somewhat fallen out of favor of mainstream physics, and a lot of people didn't think it existed. So just to wrap up the mini Lazar story, he ends up getting in trouble because he actually takes some of his friends out to an overlook that at the time was not blocked off like a lot of Area 51 is today.
Is this where John Lear fits into the story to some degree? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And so they actually took them out there to actually watch these crafts being flown.
Okay.
And so they got word that Lazar was doing this, and they fired him. And then a cover-up ensued. And officially, according to the government, Lazar never worked there at all. But to his credit, he provided a number of pay stubs that showed that he did actually work there. He was involved at Los Alamos.
A directory, too? Was there a directory?
There was a directory, and his name was actually included right there in the directory.
Right.
Yeah, you're exactly right.
Yeah, I remember. That story is so fascinating to me because, again, here's someone who, I guess you can call that whistleblowing, right? I mean, he
Absolutely,
was a whistleblower,
yes.
And probably with the greatest single story ever in mankind, especially if the veracity proves out to be correct. Right? And he's been not hiding. He, to this day, him and his family, him and his wife, his family moved, stayed in business. He's a business owner of a science supply company. Is that correct?
You are correct.
So he's hiding in plain sight, I guess, if anyone wants to say that he's not visible. He certainly is. So he's just a fascinating character.
He is, and over time, more and more of his predictions have come true. For example, he mentions element 115. He's heavily criticized for this. But over the last probably 20 years, scientists have added a number of rows to the periodic table. And what happens is some of these higher elements, like over a mass of 100, they can actually create them in a laboratory setting for a very short amount of time. And they actually were able to synthesize element 115. And it used to be called ununpentium, but now it's officially called moscovium because they worked with the Russians to do this.
Okay.
And what they basically did is they took calcium, element 20, they bombarded it with americium, element 95, 20 plus 95, they got 115. And so right now, they can only make it exist for a couple split seconds.
Right.
But the way Lazar described this was a stable form. And have you seen the movie Avatar?
I have.
It's just like the premise for Avatar. So in Avatar, it takes place in the future, and they're off on the moon of a distant planet mining what they'd call unobtainium, which is basically an element that had natural anti-gravity properties. So Lazar, to some degree, was proven right on 115, and then in 2009, he was also proven right, 2016, he was proven right on gravitational waves, because there's this amazing facility called the LIGO facility, and they basically confirmed that gravitational waves, tiny ripples in space-time, are real. So mainstream science focused solely on Albert Einstein, because he predicted this way back in the 19-teens, but Lazar ended up being right too. So far there has not been one of his claims that's actually been disproven.
Yeah, such a fascinating character. I mean, it sounded like there was attempts to early on to discredit him based upon some, I won't say inaccuracies, but it was hard to find information on his particular education. Am I right? Was that a gray area?
You are right. It seems like some of that was eliminated. The other thing that he had going against him is he was the owner of a brothel.
Yeah.
And, people have criticized that, and I'm not going to condone brothels, but technically, being Nevada...
It was legal, right?
It was legal, so he wasn't actually doing something that was illegal at the time. But you're right, there was definitely an effort to discredit him.
And during that whole period, if I'm not mistaken, without getting salacious, but just mentioning for a factual basis, I think the government was aware that he was having marriage problems, or the issue him coming forward caused marriage problems. I don't know what the particulars are there, but there was other turbulence in his life, or at least there was an attempt to create turbulence in his life to some degree. Am I
Absolutely.
right?
For a lot of these whistleblowers, it is not for the faint of heart. If you come out publicly, every attempt will be made to discredit you using every detail. And, looking at Lazar's story, Eric, sometimes you almost wonder, man, how is this guy even alive today? My personal belief is he came out so big, so fast, that he had so much publicity that it would have actually caused even more attention if something happened to him. Like, I read a number of books from UFO authors, and honestly, being in the field can be pretty dangerous. Did you know there have been over 300 UFO researchers, 300 over the last 20 years that have died prematurely, fast-acting cancers, car wrecks, number of crazy things. And a number of researchers will write in their books that if you think about publicity like a mountain, the most dangerous time is when you're climbing the mountain on the one side. You might be doing good work, you might be bringing a lot of secrets to light, but because people don't really know about you yet, you could be eliminated and nobody would know. Lazar, though, I think part of what's kept him safe is he immediately got up to that mountain peak. And so he's one of the few...
He made enough noise, what you're trying to say.
Oh, absolutely.
Immediately.
That's come out, and he's been safe. Another angle that you can look at with that, I think there's a good chance over the past 40, 50 years, there have been people essentially pre-selected to basically whistleblow and gradually move us to disclosure. Perfect example, I have a lot of respect for this man. I've heard him speak in person, but was Colonel Charles Halt, who became very, very famous in 1980 with the Rendlesham Forest UFO encounter in Britain. And he came out very publicly. All the Geiger counter readings, audio recordings still exist. And he basically said this was a highly unusual event. Most people in the military would have been immediately censored. Halt was not, and he's continued to tell that story to this day.
But was he the commanding officer you're referring to? Because there was two enlisted men who discovered the craft.
You're
Is that
exactly
right?
right. Burroughs and Peniston, and I got to hear from them. And it was an interesting base. It was a joint U.S.-British base on British soil that at the time had one of the only nuclear bombing fleets on Earth.
This is 1980?
This is 1980, and this was a secure place. So Peniston and Burroughs find it first. They come back to the base. Initially, nobody believes them, but then Halt leads an expedition to go back out into the woods, and their encounter was pretty wild.
There's audio recordings, actual audio recordings in existence of his reaction. Am I right?
There is, and you can still hear them today. They're not tough to find online, and it was a spectacular encounter. Do you want to talk about that?
Absolutely.
All right.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
It's a pretty wild one because initially Peniston and Burroughs are out in the woods off the base. They get permission to go investigate these strange lights in the woods. And they describe seeing what looked like a small black pyramid-shaped object that was hovering above the ground. It was casting a red light on the ground, and it had some type of odd hieroglyphic font around it. And if this sounds familiar to our listeners, this is also very similar to the Kecksburg UFO crash right outside Pittsburgh, which we might talk about. One of the men actually walks up to the object and reaches out and touches it. And he said not only was it warm to the touch, but he said as soon as he did it, his brain was actually flooded with binary code.
Okay.
Essentially ones and zeros.
So let me stop you for a second,
Sure.
because that's where I was going to ask. That's what I was going to ask you about, Jim, had you not mentioned that, because not all accounts of that particular story mention that part of it.
You're right. And I even asked Halt about that in person because I was fascinated. And he actually said that it was relatively new to him. He did not know about it at the time, and he had just learned it over the last couple years because Peniston and Burroughs had also been doing speaking tours. And so some skeptics, that's led them to believe that he actually made it up after the fact.
Okay.
The interesting thing, and I apologize, I forget whether it was Peniston or Burroughs that actually touched it, but he did not know about binary code. And so for our listeners, binary code, prefix bi meaning two, it's essentially just a single string of ones and zeros. It's like the basis for almost all computer language. And so years later, he actually took this to a friend of his that had knowledge of binary code, and he found that it actually made a message in English where it basically showed the latitude and longitude coordinates of the Bentwaters base, and it basically described a scientific mission, a survey mission, where they were checking in. So that's that angle. But just very quickly back to Halt, they actually go back out in the woods. They see the craft the following night. He then sees it shoot up into the sky and join multiple UFOs in the sky. It then shoots a bright, concentrated beam of light down at his feet, not unlike a laser. And then It disappears, all the objects merge together, and it shoots off. They did end up finding 3 circular depressions in a triangle on the ground, and the Geiger counter readings were very high.
Right.
Halt actually wrote a memo to his superiors, and not only did nothing happen, but the military dismissed the depressions as hens nesting and rabbits burrowing.
I didn't hear that.
And they claimed that the strange lights in the woods were simply the refraction of a nearby lighthouse beam that had been there for decades.
Yeah, that's the part of the story. I didn't hear about the hens.
Yeah, the hens.
Was the idea first floated that it might have been a Russian craft?
Oh, that actually comes up more, I would say, with the Kecksburg crash.
Okay.
Because around, and we can get into that.
Well, let's do that.
Yeah. You want to do Kecksburg
Yeah, let's
now?
do Kecksburg. Yes, let's do it. That's because that's hit close to home for us.
It is.
right?
Well, I feel like I've been talking too much already.
No,
Why
this
don't
is
you
good.
just give like the basis for what you know about Kecksburg, and I can fill in the blanks on it.
Well, this is where I'm a little cloudy. Boy, I'm really cloudy here because I think I merged 2 instances together, and if I do, please tell me because I
it's okay.
want to discuss both of them.
Okay.
The Nazis had a bell.
Oh yes, they allegedly
They
had
had a
a
device
bell.
called the bell.
Allegedly, they
Does
did.
that then the users of the bell or those who escaped by using the bell, did they end up in Kecksburg, or am I mixing 2 particular stories together?
You are not, and that ties into Kecksburg, and that's part of what makes it
I'm
an
gonna let you
amazing.
lay it on me, man, because
Okay.
I think I know the basic framework, but I don't want any misinformation.
All right, let's do it. So December 1965. So to kind of put that in context for our listeners, the United States and Soviet Union are heavily embroiled in the space race. The United States is in the midst of the Gemini program, so people are really looking skyward. And on one night in December, there are reports of a UFO that's picked up at multiple locations, zigzagging its way across the Midwest in the direction of western Pennsylvania. And people described it flying erratically and shooting brightly colored sparks out of it. It then seemingly comes to Earth in a little hamlet outside of Pittsburgh called Kecksburg. So some young boys get there first. It crashes in a grotto of trees, and eventually the Kecksburg Volunteer Fire Company gets there too. And as soon as they get there, they see it is clearly not a meteorite. It appears to be a small acorn-shaped craft with a raised rim around the bottom, no bigger really than one man could fit in, and it appears to have odd hieroglyphic writing around the rim. It also clearly crashed there because you could see it basically made a gouge into the dirt. So they're there investigating, but then somebody tipped off the military that it was there, or the military may have been tracking this object, and then they arrived, pushed the volunteer fire company out of the woods, cordoned off the woods, and did not let anybody in for a couple hours. Officially, nothing was there, but eyewitnesses said about 2 hours later, a large flatbed truck was brought in, and a single object covered under a tarp about the size that the initial witnesses described was removed from the woods. And it's a fascinating case because people go so many different directions with it. The main idea is that this was actually a crashed UFO. So some people believe that it was. Others, there's now a controversy in the Pennsylvania UFO community because some believe it has a very natural explanation. Around the same time, a Soviet Cosmos 98 satellite crashed back to Earth. And that itself, Eric, is a little bit of a conspiracy. The Cosmos satellites were simply communication satellites. But some allege, this is kind of a neat twist on the space race, this was actually one of the Russian Venera probes that was supposed to go the whole way to Venus. The Soviets had a couple that were very, very successful. And so some allege that it was a malfunction. So to try to save the embarrassment of losing a Venus probe, the Soviets just rebranded it a Cosmos, which was just a communication satellite, because they do look somewhat similar. But to your point, others think that the Nazis were somewhat involved. So is it okay if we go down a little rabbit hole on Nazis?
Absolutely.
So what's really fascinating is despite their overall wicked agenda despite the fact that the Nazis tried to wipe entire races of people from the planet. Both the United States and Soviet Union were absolutely fascinated by the progress the Nazis had made technologically and propaganda-wise in World War II. So even as World War II was coming to a close, we already see the seeds for the Cold War that would come in the decades to follow.
It ended up becoming the elements of NASA. Am I right? We ended up getting
absolutely right.
Without that technology, that German technology, NASA may have never launched.
You're exactly right. It was a big boost. So the United States is racing the Soviets to basically get the best Nazi technology and the best scientists. So the United States essentially gets the A team. This would include Wernher von Braun, one of the founders of NASA, and the Nazi main rocket designers, as well as a number of their V2s, Vengeance Weapon Number 2. This was like the first intercontinental ballistic missile.
This is right after World War II?
This is, the Nazis are using V1s and V2s towards the end of World War II, but it was so late they couldn't turn the tide. They bring them back to the United States under a secret program called Operation Paperclip. And it was essentially called that. Truman authorized it because they would take the real identities of these Nazis, which at the time, the rest of them are being tried in the Nuremberg war trials and executed. And they essentially paperclipped new identities over these men. They're initially taken to Fort Bliss, Texas, and then on to White Sands, New Mexico, and they give an enormous boost to the Army rocket program, which was trailing way behind. The Soviets, meanwhile, essentially get the Nazi B team. They don't get a lot of the engineers like von Braun. They actually get the men on the assembly line, as well as some of the V2s. They take them back to Russia, and under one of their designers, Sergei Korolev, they begin their space program, which ends up actually outpacing the Americans. Now, where the bell comes in, there are legends that the Nazis were very, very close to anti-gravity propulsion. Some believe they had even gotten it, but they didn't have it in time to turn the war. Some believe that they got this through dabbling in the occult. Some believe, according to even some of the Nazis themselves, they actually made contact with an extraterrestrial race surrounding the red star Aldebaran, which is about 60 light years away. But the two programs we want to look at are the Bell, which you mentioned, and also, have you heard of the Nazi Haunebues?
No.
You should check them out. So the Haunebu were basically blueprints of at least 4 different designs that look exactly like what we would describe as flying saucers today. And Haunebu 1 through Haunebu 4 got bigger and bigger and bigger, and they actually appear to be anti-gravity crafts. So we had the blueprints, which were brought back to the United States, but we don't know if they actually flew. So curiously, Eric, after we bring those Nazis back, we get our first real large wave of flying saucer sightings in the Southwest United States. Coincidentally. So some believe it was actually because we were working on the atomic bomb. And so other civilizations noticed from very far out in the cosmos to come and check. Some believe those UFOs had a much more earthly source, and they were actually Nazi rocket technology and anti-gravity technology we were trying here. Now, the Bell is a little less certain, but I love the story. The Bell was called the Bell, or Die Glock, because it was bell-shaped, just like the Kecksburg object. Some believe it was simply another Haunebu. Others believe that this was actually the first Nazi attempt at a time machine. And sure enough, a number of high-ranking Nazis completely disappeared after the war. It is highly likely that the story of Hitler committing suicide in a bunker in Berlin with his wife, that was not actually Hitler, that Hitler likely survived the war.
It was a double, right?
Yes, he actually had, like a lot of political figures, he had a number of body doubles. And a lot of people believe that was actually his body double, a man named Gustav Weller. And people think, well, how can that be possible? They have pictures of the Soviets there with his body. What's interesting is the Soviets burned Hitler's body. They bury it in East Berlin. But then in the 80s, when they know that they have to turn back Germany to the actual Germans, they didn't want that to become an actual patronage site for Nazis. So the KGB digs the body back up, burns it again, and then throws it in the nearby Elbe River. So the only actual piece of Hitler they officially had left was a skull fragment. But a couple years ago, Eric, a female scientist got permission to actually do DNA testing on it, and she found that the DNA actually matched a woman in her early 20s. So there's a lot of nebulosity around Hitler.
I did not hear that.
Even a couple years ago, President Trump actually ordered a number of the JFK assassination files to be declassified.
I remember that. What happened there?
Well, what's interesting, the intelligence agencies put up a big push to keep these things classified, even all these years later. And the president said, no, we really need these out. And some of the documents that came out were fascinating, and they didn't even directly relate to Kennedy. It turns out, and you can find these documents online, the CIA was pursuing leads that Hitler and other top Nazis actually escaped to Argentina. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean they absolutely did, but it at least shows that our intelligence agencies were skeptical enough about Hitler dying that they wanted to follow up on these
that
leads.
had leaked generations ago or decades ago, right? Because the Argentina story goes back a long ways.
Oh, yes. Actually,
but it was folklore at that point.
At that point, and after the war, about 250,000 Nazis totally vanished, 250,000. So some went to Argentina and Chile, and sadly, they actually accomplished this through what were called the Vatican rat lines. So the Vatican actually had essentially these human trafficking networks set up. And despite what the Nazis had done, because many of them were Roman Catholic, the Vatican assisted in getting them out. So a number went to Chile and Argentina, where we still have a number of small German-named towns today. And then there's an allegation that many actually fled to Antarctica, where there was an under ice base, which is pretty interesting. But real quick, I don't want to meander too much. Back to the bell itself.
Yes.
So when this object crashes in Kecksburg, some allege that this was actually the end result of Nazi time travel, and that this was not actually an alien craft, but it was some type of time machine that had actually crashed in the future relative to World War II. And I do have one pretty fascinating personal MUFON case, if you don't mind.
Okay, sure, absolutely.
All right, great. So with MUFON cases, a lot of them, people will submit them if they just had a sighting yesterday or a week or a month ago. But we also get, Eric, what are called historical sightings. So maybe somebody had a sighting when they were a child, decades ago, but it's always stuck with them. And they can actually submit this case to MUFON whenever they want. And one of the challenges is with human memory, when people are submitting a case that happened decades ago, sometimes they struggle to remember some of the details. But I got this historical case from a gentleman who back in the mid-60s was a very young man. And he remembered driving home from school with his sister one day. It was still daytime. And he said all these cars were pulled off the road. And so they pulled off the road too. And above a clearing with a power line, he said that all the onlookers were stunned because they could actually see an acorn craft that was hovering there. But he said to me over the phone, he said it didn't look like it was working right. So a little bit cheeky, I said to him, I said, well, how's an acorn-shaped ship supposed to work? And he said, well, he said, you could just tell that something was wrong. It was listed over on its side like it was out of balance, and it was shooting sparks out of it. And he said it hovered there for a bit. We all watched it, and then it shot off and disappeared in the direction of Pittsburgh. And I asked him again, I said, wait a minute, when did you have the sighting? And he said, I can't remember the actual day, but I know for a fact it was getting colder. I know it was December, and I know it was the year 1965. And I'm thinking to myself, well, holy heck, December 1965, that's when the Kecksburg crash was. Now, I personally don't believe it was the same day because the eyewitness accounts from Kecksburg, as I mentioned, described the UFO zigzagging in from the Midwest and over to Pittsburgh, whereas this man lived in the center part of Pennsylvania and described this ship as going west. But what's fascinating to me, Eric, is to me personally, that adds credence to the story. Maybe this was not an actual alien craft. Maybe we had something very advanced. We were dabbling with anti-gravity technology. We didn't have it quite figured out. And then a couple days later, one of these crashed.
Yeah, it's pretty horrific to think about if you put yourself back in that time, did they launch two people in this device not knowing what the result was going to be? Was there multiple devices that were launched all like in succession? I mean, it's just really the time travel thing. I think we'll get there.
Sure.
But that element of the story is just fascinating to me.
Well, and it's funny that you say that because not so much with the United States, at least for the Mercury program, where we have the famous astronauts like Alan Shepard and John Glenn. That was fairly public knowledge, but some people allege on the Soviet side, just like the Nazis ended up using people as guinea pigs, they believe that the Soviets, to try to win the first leg of the space race, were launching or trying to launch a number of people into space. And Yuri Gagarin was not actually the first human in space to orbit Earth. He was the first to make it back alive.
Right.
So, very quick side story. Can we talk about the quote-unquote lost cosmonauts?
This is your show, pal.
So, there are a number of pretty interesting cases from the late 50s to early 60s of ham radio operators here in the United States intercepting what sounded like Russian correspondence between an astronaut and some type of Soviet mission control that was likely at their home base called Star City. And
was the voice female? There
was a female voice. There were one or two that were male voices, but one or two that were female voices. And I'm glad that you heard that because in the female one, she sounds highly panicked, describes there being a fire, and then it just cuts out.
Right.
So skeptics have basically alleged that no, the Soviets weren't running a secret program. What they allege, and you might know a little background in this from your experience with AM radio, was that the ham radio operators weren't actually intercepting signals from outer space. They were intercepting AM radio waves that were bouncing off the ionosphere from Russia and coming back down.
Okay.
So from our perspective, it looked like they were coming from outer space. What's intriguing to me, though, Eric, and this is crazy, and this is confirmed, if you look at a lot of the early pictures of the early Soviet cosmonauts, there are airbrushed ones where entire men and women are just brushed out of the picture. And this is like totally,
I've seen that.
Totally like a Russian thing. Like you see the whole crew, and then the Soviets re-release the picture, and a couple people in the picture, same picture, but they're just totally gone.
Right.
So that's the lost cosmonauts idea.
Yeah, that totally meets with any kind of rational belief because that's just how as a people that they operated in that era.
Well, and absolutely. And the crazy thing, if you actually go through the space race, I would say the United States actually gets a little more reckless than the Soviet Union does to try to beat them. Absolutely they do. Not only do we lose an entire crew tragically on Apollo 1, which caught fire on the launch pad, but probably my favorite Apollo mission is Apollo 8.
Okay.
Now, for those that don't know, Apollo 8 predates Apollo 11, where they famously land on the moon, but this is actually the first manned mission to go to the moon. And the United States at the time was trying to hurry because they were fearing an imminent Soviet flight around the moon or a landing.
Okay.
Because a lot of people don't know, and I only learned this a couple years ago, the Soviets, did you know this? They actually sent animals out to orbit around the moon and brought them back safely. And it included a couple tortoises, and they picked tortoises because they thought tortoises would be more resistant to the radiation of outer space. And it actually safely splashed down in the Indian Ocean, but there was a U.S. destroyer nearby spying on the recovery. And they basically radioed back and said, hey, the Soviets brought back these animals from the moon. So the United States, in a hurry to try to beat them, sent Apollo 8 out to the moon.
Right.
And so this had Frank Borman, Bill Anders, and Jim Lovell. And at the time, Eric, they did not even have the lunar module ready yet. They only had the tiny cone-shaped command module. And at the time, they had never brought anything back from outside of Earth orbit. And like the crazy thing is, if you're just orbiting Earth, you only have to be going about 17,000 miles per hour. If you're coming back from the moon, you're moving at a speed of about 25,000 miles per hour. And at the time, the United States hadn't brought anything back. So this was essentially a suicide mission, but the mission goes almost flawlessly, and those men make it back. So long story short, it's easy to stereotype the Russians and think, oh, those Soviets, they went crazy. But the United States took a number of risks, too.
Yeah, we've been just as vicious. In the Apollo, let's go to the Apollo mission. A lot of people, myself included, have been skeptical, either completely or somewhat skeptical, that maybe we didn't go to the moon. Maybe because you hear all kinds of stories.
Right.
I call it the Van Halen belt, but then there's another.
Oh, Van Allen belt.
Van Allen
Correct.
belt, right? It's the radiation belt. There's a lot of conflicting information. It sounds more realistic that we went and came back as history tells.
Right.
However, there's a lot of kinks in the story.
Yes.
And would you say there's a lot of people still believing? Would you guess that we did not actually step on the moon?
I'm glad that you asked this. I would say we could probably do a whole episode just about this.
Okay.
But briefly, I actually believe there is a growing number of people that are actually becoming rather skeptical about the Apollo moon landings. And I think the main reason why is officially we have not been back since Apollo 17, 1972.
Why is that?
That's a great question. And I am up to, it's a challenge for me as an astronomy teacher because I read so many books about all angles of the Apollo mission. Some people just read conspiracy angles because they like that.
Right.
I read everything.
Absolutely.
I read the biographies.
It's part of being an educator,
Oh,
right?
my gosh, absolutely. And so in class, I basically present it exactly as history shows. And I truly hope it is that way. But to my adult groups, I give a number of different theories. And I think I am up to about 13 different theories on what could have happened on the Apollo missions. And, not to go through all 13, but there are a number of reasons that officially we may not have been back, assuming the landings are real as recorded by history. Some ideas some people have is there was a very strong extraterrestrial presence on the moon that was discovered by both the U.S. and Soviet Union prior to the first landings.
And that gets into the hidden medical channel of communications, right?
Yes, it does do that. And I guess just to speak on that briefly, when the Apollo astronauts would talk back to the Earth, there would be a public channel, there would be a dump tape channel, and as you said, there would be a hidden medical channel. And even on Apollo 11, this is Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon for the first time, while Michael Collins orbited above in the command module. Not only did they start their lunar excursion far earlier than was expected, but there was about 2 to 2.5 minutes of total silence. And that's where that legend comes in, because ham radio operators allegedly intercepted the exchange on the secure channel.
They're on the ridge.
Yes, and it described Armstrong in basically a panic, saying there are disc-shaped ships parked on the crater rim and they are watching us.
Right.
And, I've read Armstrong's official autobiography, First Man. You can see why they picked him first. He was as straight of a shooter as they would come.
That press conference is odd, though, to me.
It is odd, isn't it?
It's odd.
The body language. And
They're looking at each other with their eyes. After the question's asked, unless I'm reading it wrong, Jim, but when the questions are asked, they seem to be, they're all kind of, the other two are looking to Armstrong to answer, but
right.
There's a look of uncertainty.
And there are, unfortunately, a couple times they're caught in direct lies during that conference. And about mundane things that they would have no reason to lie about. Can I give just one example?
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
So one of the questions that is asked by a British reporter, and this is, for those of you listening, this is the Apollo 11 post-flight conference. So this is Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins.
They can look that up, right? That's something that's on YouTube.
They can. It is on YouTube. And this would be a couple weeks after they got back, because as soon as these men were brought back, they were essentially quarantined for 3 to 4 weeks because NASA was worried about moon germs being brought back. But the question that was asked was very simple. It was basically, when you were in outer space, could you see the stars? And when you were on the lunar surface, could you see the stars? And Armstrong responds first. And his answer is likely not technically wrong. He said when they were on the lunar surface, because there was so much reflected light off the surface of the moon, you could not see the stars, even though the moon has no atmosphere. So even when the sun's out, they should be brilliant. Armstrong said you could really only see them when you were in the shadow of the lunar lander, which technically might not be wrong. The part that comes in that's definitely wrong is then Michael Collins tries to add to that. And he says, I don't recall seeing stars at all. And at that point, Armstrong gives him what's been dubbed the shut up elbow, where he basically gestures towards Collins, and a second camera angle reviews that he didn't physically elbow him, but he goes in this direction. And for those of you listening, if you think about it, Michael Collins cannot say the same thing, because unlike Neil and Buzz, who are walking on the lunar surface, Collins is by himself, still orbiting the moon.
Perspective.
Absolutely, in the lunar module. And when he is on the far side of the moon, away from the Earth, and it's totally dark, he should have been able to get the most brilliant view of the cosmos that man has ever seen.
Right.
And even from his Gemini flights, which stayed in Earth orbit, because Michael Collins actually did a great spacewalk on Gemini, he describes how brilliant the stars are, and it was awe-inspiring. Correct. And then by Apollo, he said, well, I can't see stars at all, which is also a lie, Eric, because the astronauts had a little sextant on board and a telescope.
Right.
They actually needed to use the stars to be able to navigate to know exactly where they were.
So my theory has always been for a long time that we did launch, we did send 3 men up there, but I think they just potentially circled the Earth. They went there and they splashed down again. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the film that we see was staged and created. Now, when you say that mixed company, I will tell you, you get some far out looks. But there's so many things that just don't make any sense to me. And you have scientists, that'll say one thing, and then an equally educated scientist in the same field will say something else. It's hard to really, you have to make up your own mind, right?
I'm really glad you brought up that theory, because among my 13 ideas, one of the ideas is they did launch, but the final S4B stage of the Saturn V was disabled, and so they had to remain in Earth orbit. And what's interesting is part of the reason that people shy away from Apollo moon landing conspiracies is for people who grew up during that decade, these astronauts were their absolute
it's
heroes.
Patriotic, right?
Absolutely,
it was Kennedy's vision that was realized 10 years later, or whatever it was. I mean, it's part of the Americana. It's almost sacrilegious in terms of Americana to go against that.
You're absolutely right. But to me, let's run with your scenario for a minute. When you look at the very different body language of the astronauts when they got back to Earth, it would be very consistent with them not realizing the mission was going to be changed on them. And even when you watch the way Armstrong begins that press conference, it's almost painful to watch. Now, on one hand, he was never as comfortable in front of the media as other astronauts were.
Right.
But he almost stutters and hesitates to begin, and you almost feel bad, like he's waiting for somebody to bail him out and nobody comes. So probably the best piece of video evidence to support your hypothesis about them staying in Earth orbit, there is a phenomenal British documentary that you can find on YouTube, and I apologize, I can't think of the name off the top of my head, but it's not tough to find. And the biggest piece of footage in question, and it was never actually aired on TV.
I've seen that.
Have you seen it?
I've seen that.
Inadvertently leaks out. And so for our listeners or our viewers, basically it starts with a standard NASA blue screen, and I believe the date shown is July 19th, 1969. And you can see a relatively large view of the Earth. Now, the problem right away with that is the moon landing was July 20th. So by that point, according to the flight plan, they should have been much, much closer to the moon. The Earth should have been much, much smaller. Right. Now, initially, I started out very skeptical on this, because the skeptical take on this video is the astronauts were orbiting Earth, like you said, and they basically used a black mask to cover most of the window of the command module and then film the Earth so it looked farther away. So initially I'm thinking, come on, like there's no way they would use such low-end technology. Here's what's interesting about the clip. They are filming the Earth, but during the filming, you see something from the interior of the command module move in front of the Earth and back out. And for those of you trying to visualize this, what that proves is they did not have the cameras right up to the window. They were essentially filming from the back of the command module. Now, just imagine being on vacation, going somewhere scenic, and instead of rolling down your window and having the camera right at the window, you say, hey, I'm going to sit way back in the back seat of our van, and I'm going to try to take a shot forward. You wouldn't do it. So not only does it prove that something was being filmed from the back of the module, far from the window, but then the footage keeps rolling, and the documentary alleges that the stop button on the camera popped back up and it kept recording. So they then turn on the cabin lights in the interior and you can see the entire scene. And behind Michael Collins and his window, you can see a big blue limb of something right behind him that had to be the Earth. Now, there's a follow-up. Have you heard about Bart Sibrel and Buzz Aldrin in this clip?
I know Buzz is pretty caustic and feisty in his older age. That's
Oh,
all
yes.
That's all. When I hear that name, my mind goes
Right.
right to all those confrontations, but not this particular one.
Well, let me just give, if you don't mind, a quick aside on
Yeah,
Buzz Aldrin.
absolutely.
Because it's almost a shame to me that most of the fame and attention has gone to Neil Armstrong. Because if you truly wanted to argue who has been the better ambassador for the United States and space travel over the decades since, it has to be
Who's
Buzz
towed
Aldrin.
the company line better?
Oh, absolutely. And you know, Neil Armstrong, like people say that he disappeared. He didn't actually disappear. He basically took a professor's job at the University of Cincinnati, which is kind of wild. That would almost be like LeBron James saying, you know what, I'm going to leave the NBA and I'm just going to go play in like a community rec league. Like
Right.
nothing against the University of Cincinnati, but that is not where
understand.
you would expect Neil Armstrong to go. So he went there and really did not give a lot of interviews later in life. Buzz Aldrin has remained very, very active.
But well, hold on. We'll go back to Buzz before
Sure.
I forget now. There was a very late in life interview. I don't know how far from that interview or a speech possibly to his death where he talks about the need for young people to seek the truth, essentially,
Yes.
but a bunch of verbiage put there. Is that right?
You're right. You're very well
And
versed.
people always talk about that particular speech before he passed or before he got too old.
Yes.
That to wake up because something's not as it seems.
It's a great speech. It actually happened. And I know this because it's part of that British documentary.
Okay.
It happens in 1994 when Bill Clinton's in the White House. Neil Armstrong is in to make an address. And the more cryptic part of the speech is he tells these young people that there are great truths out there to be discovered if we can remove truth's protective layers.
Yes, that's
And
it. That's it.
He also
That's
he was very witty, and he made an analogy of the astronauts to a parrot, which basically he joked that it means we can speak pretty well but can't fly all that great. And a lot of people laughed it off, but some people think Armstrong, being very, very brilliant himself, he intentionally picked the parrot because what does a parrot do? Over time, it will repeat what it's told. Even years following that, there was a 60 Minutes interview with him, and he basically said that he did not want to be solely defined by the moon landing. And very, very odd for somebody
Sure.
whose life has been made by that. to
Sure,
say
that's interesting.
But on Buzz Aldrin,
Yes.
phenomenal character. His autobiography, I really encourage people to check out, is called Magnificent Desolation. And those were actually his first words on the moon, which a lot of people don't know. But the crazy thing about the book, Eric, what I love about it, he probably covers the whole Apollo 11 moon landing within like the first 70 pages. And it's all about the struggles he had when he gets back to Earth. A lot of people don't realize as soon as they got back, not only did NASA quarantine them for like 3-4 weeks, they immediately then sent them out on a breakneck worldwide tour.
They're celebrities.
Yeah, absolutely. For a full year. And that caused a lot of problems in his marriage. He took up alcohol. And then you really feel bad because he describes something that I think celebrities and athletes struggle with today. He basically said, you know what, when I got back, I really struggled to find anything that made me feel relevant that I could do here. He's like, I just walked on the moon. How in the world do I then top that and do anything else and go back into society?
Right.
But very quickly, back to Armstrong and Sobrell. Have you heard of Bart Sobrell?
Is he a documentary? Is he the documentary person who tries to confront?
Yes.
He confronted Armstrong. He confronted Collins. Edgar Mitchell will fit into this picture somewhere later.
Yes.
We'll talk about Edgar, but yeah, he's the denier, right? He is the Apollo denier.
Yes.
And he's the filmographer that works in that.
This is the man.
Okay.
So Bart Sobrell is not well thought of overall because he has essentially used ambush tactics.
He's a bully.
Yes, on a lot of the Apollo astronauts. He will confront them, and keep in mind the ones that are still alive are much older. They're all in their 80s now.
The Bible.
He would confront these older men, hold the Bible out, and basically on camera tell them to swear on the Bible that they actually went to the moon. And for starters, these ambush tactics have not endeared him to NASA and other astronauts. On the flip side, once these astronauts retire, it is very, very difficult to get a hold of them. And even the actual meet and greets that they will do are highly regulated. So I'm not condoning the ambush tactics in any way, but it is very tough to actually talk to these Apollo astronauts. And so Sobrell got nationally known because you might recall this, Buzz Aldrin actually punched him in the face.
Yes.
So Sobrell confronts Aldrin just on a street with the Bible, and Aldrin was fed up with it, and he knocked the guy out, which drew a lot of praise.
Right.
What people don't know, and back to this clip, is years earlier, the bad blood started there. And you can see this video on YouTube, but I'll warn viewers, it is upsetting to watch. He actually invites Aldrin in for an interview. And at the time...
Under false pretenses.
Yes. At the time, Aldrin does not know a lot about Sobrell, does not know the ambush that's about to happen. And so he has this exact footage. And he basically says to Aldrin, we have a piece of unaired footage. I would like to watch it with you. Now, if you're Buzz Aldrin and everything happened exactly as recorded by history, I would think to myself, like, yeah, bring it. You got more footage of me being awesome and walking on the moon? Like, let's watch this. That is not at all the reaction that Aldrin has. He gets very, very uptight. He asks Sobrell where the footage came from, how he got it. He insists that he watched the footage with him prior to actually being recorded watching the footage. And Sobrell keeps it very vague. He basically says, you need to see this footage. I know you want to see it. You'll recognize it. And he starts playing it. And it's that same clip we talked about earlier from the British documentary. And he's actually got a camera positioned just on Aldrin's face. And even for the start of it, Aldrin will not look directly at the screen. He's kind of like looking away from it, looking out of the corner of his eyes. And Aldrin finally says, well, what do you want me to say? Do you want me to say that we never went to the moon? And here is where Sobrell really makes a mistake. He violates the trust that an interviewer should have with the actual guest. Probably the better approach would have been for him to just say, Mr. Aldrin, we just don't understand. Help us place this footage in context. But he doesn't. He goes right into attack mode. He says,
juggler, right.
I know you didn't go to the moon. I know you've been lying about it. This proves it. And at that point, Aldrin gets up, takes off the microphone, and just walks out.
I've seen it. And he did blow it because who knows, had he taken a different approach, what Aldrin would have said.
Yes, and there are a number of alleged Buzz Aldrin tweets out there from Twitter that have since been deleted. And then, you know, this happens on Twitter. People say, well, that tweet never happened. Somebody edited
Someone's
a screenshot.
got a copy of it, though.
But there have been a number of interviews he's given, even one recently where a schoolgirl was interviewing him, and he basically says that we did not actually land on the moon. Now, in fairness to him, by this point, he's in his mid-80s. He's still very brilliant, but just think about talking to like a grandparent that's that old. It's easy to make mistakes at that age, but given the whole body of knowledge, Eric, it still makes some people a little bit worried.
There's a documentary that was extremely well done. It's about, with commercials, maybe not with commercials. It's about 2 hours long, and it does question whether we ever landed on the moon. It was produced maybe 5 or 7 years ago. I don't know the name of it, but there's there's an interview with Aldrin where he refuses to answer the question, and by avoiding direct questions, even in the modern context here, he's raising additional skepticism. They're using skepticism in the actual documentary.
Absolutely. And, I think to myself, well, what could be the cause for that? And some people suggested the reason for the reluctance is we did land on the moon, but the astronauts uncovered an active extraterrestrial presence, which was then classified, and so they couldn't talk about it. For me personally, though, Eric, that doesn't totally jive, because I think to myself, well, you know what? They at least landed on the moon, regardless of what they actually saw there. You'd think that they would still actually have pride in going there and actually landing. Even Armstrong, a lot of the direct questions to him about landing on the moon, curiously, he would answer them in the third person. He would say, well, when you land on the moon, this and this and this. And when you talk to people who study body language, not only the body language the men showed at that post-flight press conference, but also when somebody answers something in the third person, they say that if somebody is struggling with the truth, it's easier for them to essentially put themselves outside of the situation as a third-party observer.
Absolutely.
And hypothetically describe what it would be like. So
part of my rationalization was, three men of we assume great character.
Yes.
Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin. How could they buy into, if they didn't go, but they were told that we need to present this story?
Yes.
How could they buy into that? And the only thing I could think of is that maybe they were really indoctrinated in the idea that America needed this. We were in a Cold War, and we've discovered in our technology buzz, and we just can't get there. There's a radiation belt that we don't know how to put you in. So but in order to maintain our strength in the world, America needs this story. We need you to do this. Could that have been indoctrinated in them? Could that want for them to lie be so strong in their quest for virtue to save their country? Could they have done it? Could they have held on to that for so long?
I think there's a chance of that. If you actually, though, look at these men, especially if you go back to like the Mercury Gemini astronauts, these guys were not only combat veterans, they were competitive, they were hotshot pilots.
Right.
So the idea of then having to do an about face and cover this up would have been really tough for a lot of these men. So there's a couple possibilities. There's the one we talked about earlier, that they fully trained for it, expecting a full lunar mission, but then when they got to Earth orbit, it didn't end up happening. There's even a chance, at the same time, this might be a little bit of a stretch, but we'll leave that up to the listeners to decide. There's even a chance at the time the CIA was heavily involved in the first round of hypnosis, MK Ultra, and actually doing those types of mind control experiments. And what I had read in one book, which is really fascinating, is a few of the Apollo astronauts had actually been hypnotized later in life. And during the regression sessions with the hypnotherapist, they would talk about everything leading up to the Apollo mission and everything even for the early part of the flight. But then when it came to actually landing on the moon, multiple astronauts had the same exact response. Unimportant, let's move on. It's like they hit a mental wall with the hypnotherapist and there was a pre-recorded trigger, unimportant, let's move on. And then once you get past the lunar landing, then they go right back into the actual story. So there's one possibility. We did have the technology to get to the moon. Apollo 8 got to the moon and orbited around it. But both the U.S. and Soviets saw such a pervasive presence from an advanced civilization, they chose not to actually land as they officially did on Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17.
Okay.
There's even a theory that the Cold War itself was somewhat staged. And I hate to say that because for older listeners who lived through it, that's almost insulting to them to say that because of the fear of nuclear war. But it's interesting because over the past 40 years, there have been a number of once classified U.S. Soviet documents that have leaked out that actually show a great deal of cooperation between the two countries. Even John F. Kennedy, even though he gets so much credit for wanting to send us to the moon, he actually preferred a joint U.S.-Soviet exploration of the moon. He actually reached out to Nikita Khrushchev 3 different times to try to do that before we ended up winning the space race.
Right.
And so one of the theories is there was such a pervasive presence that we did not actually land. And just lastly, before I turn it back over to you, back to the Nazi Bell and anti-gravity technology, one of the more far-out theories that you don't really see in books, but I find it fascinating, I have to throw it out there, as early as 1951, the U.S. Army had a think tank project, which was called Project Horizon, which was about an eventual lunar base. And people can look it up online. They can see the original manuals. They can see all the drawings. What if we made such progress with anti-gravity technology in the years following Operation Paperclip that we actually got to the moon and maybe even Mars with this more advanced technology? Can you imagine then, Eric, having to essentially recreate the missions with much inferior chemical rocket technology to show the public?
Yeah, just it to be an operation just for show.
Yes.
While we're on the moon, going back to this documentary about the moon, it wasn't so much Apollo. It was there intelligent life on the moon? And this whole documentary was geared around seeing objects and structures. So 2 questions. In this documentary, there's a lot of NASA footage, which to me for 69 or the early 70s was remarkably good, surprisingly good. But with Google and Google's incorporation of technology and photographic evidence, wouldn't it be easier to prove we were there by taking high-resolution photographs now and seeing the crafts there, seeing the flags there? I mean, the rovers are still there, right? They wouldn't have moved 1 centimeter from where they were last left, correct?
Your questions have been excellent.
I mean,
that's sort of a whole nother.
A lot
can
of weird
worms.
thinking, pal.
No, that's good. It's interesting, Eric, because I would say over the last 10 years, every time a new large observatory opens on the Earth, and when I say observatory, that means a building that houses a really big telescope.
Right.
And telescopes are now large enough on the Earth, they should have the resolving power to be able to actually see the Apollo landing sites. So every couple years, you'll hear an astronomer basically brag like, yeah, now we can basically image them and we can prove those tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorists wrong once and for all.
Okay.
But then you never hear from them again. So we do have photographic evidence of the Apollo landing sites, but it does not come from other countries. It only comes from a lunar orbiter that NASA had above the moon. Now, for some people, this was basically case closed. Well, there they are. We photographed them. We're in good shape. But to me, if you really want to look at the scientific method, this would basically be like a headline, "Scientist confirms own findings." Like that would never fly in the scientific community, but it does with NASA.
There.
And what I found very interesting, and I honestly don't even know if you could still find it on YouTube, because sadly social media has made a very, very strong push to eliminate quite a number of videos that are asking good questions, but outside of mainstream history. But there were 2 British scientists that actually analyzed the footage closely. And they said, wait a minute, given the resolving power of this camera and the height of NASA's lunar orbiter above the lunar surface, the images that we're seeing here are actually too large. The lunar module descent stage, which is still there, the lunar rover from Apollo 15 on, the footprints, the tire tracks, are actually too large given the height of this. And then there's a young British researcher who has also gotten himself into some hot water named Jara White. Have you heard of Jara White?
No.
I would encourage you to check out his videos. He's very controversial, but he also has done some very good research. He actually took these NASA images that were released on a NASA website, and he essentially fiddled with the image dimensions. So let's say you're looking at NASA website and you've got this image of, let's say, the Apollo 15 landing site. and you've got the URL that's listed at the top.
All right.
What White did is basically like low-end computer hacking. He goes into the URL at the top, changes a couple numbers to show a bigger picture. And what he actually found was initially all the tire tracks, all the evidence of the astronauts being there, after you zoomed out, they cut off clean at the edges of the original picture.
So it's pasted in.
He posted this, and then eventually the images were then changed. So, I mean, me personally, I want to believe it in the worst way. I would like nothing better than to find out all of the Apollo missions happened exactly as recorded by history. But if you actually look into these things, there are a number of things that raise concern. And so far as we talk here in 2020, we have yet to have any other countries, any commercial space agencies actually fly over the moon and re-photograph the sites.
Why? My question is why?
Well, and very frustrating, NASA a couple years ago actually declared all of the airspace. Now, there's no air on the moon, but they still call it airspace. All of the airspace above all of the Apollo landing sites as off limits to other countries for fear of quote unquote contamination of the site. So
a site that you never go back to.
Nobody can own the moon, but NASA actually went forward and said nobody can fly over those sites. And it's concerning to people. And, you know, honestly, Eric, had we continued with the Apollo missions, had we gone back to the moon in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s,
there wouldn't be any question.
People wouldn't be asking these questions now, but look at how rapidly technology doubles.
That's where I want to go.
According to Moore's law, about every 7 years, computing power doubles.
Right.
And so just do some ballpark math on how many times it's doubled since 1969. And I always tell my students in class, I say, think about all the technology you're using today at home. And I say to them, I bet all of you have a cell phone that's less than 3 years old. They're all smartphones. All of you, even if your family doesn't have a lot of money, you probably all have at least one flat screen TV because they're dirt cheap now. And I said, all of the technology that you are using is probably less than 5 years old. Now look at outer space. When we look at space flight today, which in theory should be the most advanced technology we have, all we're doing is we're repurposing old chemical rocket technology from the 50s. We right now are using 1950s technology to head back into space. Right. Even with SpaceX, Blue Origin, NASA's Space Launch System, they're just bigger liquid chemical rockets with solid rocket boosters on the side. So some people believe that NASA is essentially in an intentional stall to go back to the moon. And think about how many times, just over the past 20 years, that they keep pushing the moon landings back. So some people think that this is because we still can't do it, which I personally don't believe. But I think there's a good chance that we already have human colonies on the moon. I think there's a good chance we have been to Mars. We have colonies there. There have been a number of whistleblowers that have come out publicly and say that. But we are not using the space travel technology that we see on our televisions. It's a more advanced anti-gravity technology that can get to these places in a number of minutes.
Who was the British hacker that made news maybe 10 years ago, maybe?
Yes.
And he found a lot of U.S. government documents. He was deep in the NSA or something,
Yes.
or maybe it was NASA. I don't know where he was, but did he uncover alien information, or did he uncover fake moon landing information? What did he have that made him so famous?
The man's name was Gary McKinnon.
That's it. His name was similar to my own last name. That's why I remember that story so well.
And he was a Scottish hacker, and back in the mid-2000s, he perpetrates what some call the greatest computer hack of all time. Now, a little background on McKinnon. He is a man with autism, and if anybody has a loved one with autism, you know that in some areas socially they can struggle, but in other areas they're absolutely brilliant. And McKinnon's computer hacking ability he had in spades. So over a course of many months, he hacks computers at the CIA, the NSA, and NASA. And he wasn't doing this, according to him, to be famous or to be a whistleblower. He himself just had a personal fascination with extraterrestrial life and wanted to see if it was actually true. And where he got the greatest prize was with NASA computers. He found a few file folders, and he found two separate file folders. In one, it would have original pictures that shuttle astronauts had taken from Earth orbit that would show a number of UFOs near the space station hovering in Earth orbit. And then the second file folder would have those same pictures, but all the UFOs were airbrushed out. There have even been at least 2 women that have come forward who were confirmed NASA employees and said their job at NASA was to basically airbrush these things out.
Right.
The other thing that McKinnon found that's probably the most famous is he found Excel files of fleet-to-fleet transfers of what were dubbed non-terrestrial officers. And these names of the ships look similar to U.S. naval ships. It would be the USS blank, but these were not names that McKinnon had ever heard. So he basically uncovered a program that was called Solar Warden, where, according to his hack, the United States already had at least 8 large cigar-shaped ships and about 36 smaller, shorter-range craft, and we had basically already had a space fleet. So McKinnon not only eventually gets caught at this, but the frustrating thing is he does not save anything that he finds. And some people find that suspicious. But again, his main interest was just knowing for himself. He wasn't trying to be a whistleblower.
Right.
But what makes this case very credible, because I've never seen it argued that this is a hoax, is the United States threatens to extradite him to stand trial in the U.S. over many, many months. But they end up not doing it. McKinnon remains a free man to this day, and the reason was, if they actually forced him to stand trial, he still had a right to a defense.
Right.
His defense attorneys could actually subpoena U.S. officials and question them on the record about UFOs.
Got it.
So that's the Solar Warden program. And just to talk a little bit about presidents, a couple years ago, President Trump made headlines, as he usually does, because he said that he wanted the creation of the Space Force.
Right.
And a number of his critics came out and said, oh, the Space Force, like, that's so ridiculous. We can have Marines in space. My own personal belief is probably during his first presidential classified briefing, where they essentially, the intelligence agencies, bring the president up to speed, so to speak. My guess is he already learned at least something about the Solar Warden program. And this was basically his way of gradually bringing it out to the public. So just watch, Eric. Someday the space fleet is just suddenly going to be there, and it's going to be huge. And there's a chance we have it, and there's even a chance we have had it as early as Ronald Reagan's time. Did you hear about his memoirs at all?
No.
So in Reagan's memoirs, one of them, he mentions that he's about to be briefed by some intelligence officials about the space program. And then in the next memoir, he remarks that it was a fascinating briefing, and he had no idea that we had the capacity to orbit at least 300 people in space at one time. And when he actually wrote this, this is early 80s. So even if you've got all 5 space shuttles still in operation, so this is before Challenger blows up, the max capacity of any one space shuttle was 8 astronauts.
Right.
So even if you had all 5 in space at one time, that's 40 astronauts.
Right.
Reagan is saying there's 300.
In the early 80s.
Early 80s. And he in some of his speeches talked about, because this is late Cold War, he's saying, I really think the nations of the world would come together.
Oh, the UN speech.
Yes.
Fascinating.
If they were suddenly faced with a common extraterrestrial adversary.
He actually said, I think he said alien threat.
He did.
I think he did.
And his speechwriters, this is interesting because a lot of these presidents, their stuff is written by speechwriters. But he actually fought his speechwriter to include that in 2 different speeches.
Right.
Now, some critics of Reagan have said, well, he was old by that point. He was starting to get senile. He didn't know what he's saying. But a lot of people think that this was basically his admission that we already knew that there were other civilizations out there.
It has to, let's go into the premise that there's all this activity being hidden from the American public. And when you become president, supposedly there should be no secrets from you. Supposedly. Now, I want to talk about that, but do you think that they learn they learn things, and it eats at their sensibilities, and they each in their own way find ways to leave, like, a carrot or leave like a breadcrumb somehow, because there's a lot of talk of that.
I think there's a very good chance of that. I really think we assume that the president knows everything. I think as early as the 1960s, even the presidents are on a need-to-know basis for some things.
Does that disturb you as a citizen when you hear that?
It does a little bit. Basically, and JFK had many great speeches about the national secrecy apparatus and how dangerous it was.
Eisenhower had it as well.
He did. Eisenhower was the first to warn about the quote-unquote military-industrial complex.
Right.
One of the side theories of the Kennedy assassination is he was actually eliminated because he was on the verge of disclosing to the public UFOs. Because I had mentioned Khrushchev earlier. He had actually made multiple appeals to the CIA, which Kennedy personally despised, that he wanted UFO records shared openly with the Soviets. And the reason was his fear was that sooner or later there would be a UFO that would violate U.S. or Soviet airspace. The violated country would assume it was the other country being an aggressor, and it would lead to nuclear war. So only 11 days before his assassination, he actually penned a memo saying he wanted all the UFO information declassified. Bill Clinton usually comes up a lot with UFOs. He had publicly said multiple occasions that he wanted to share what happened at Roswell. He even actually put a friend of his into an appointed position at the Justice Department. And he basically said to him, if I put you at justice, I want to know two things. I want to know who shot JFK. I want to know what happened at Roswell. And supposedly even Bill Clinton was blacklisted from that. He was not actually allowed to know that. President Obama, there were rumors that
Podesta,
he was...
right? John Podesta was a big...
Yes. And I mean, that's like, there's a whole side thing going on with Podesta now, but not to get too deep into politics, but Podesta's interest in UFOs, President Obama was supposed to be, quote unquote, the disclosure president, and he said very little. Now, some believe that's because the president is not allowed to say. Others have a more upsetting take where if we truly knew the full reality of extraterrestrials, we just simply would not be able to handle it. And you might think, well, after this many years, it's gradually desensitized us. We could probably handle it today. But there's a lot of really wild theories out there that would still be upsetting. Just one real quick, Eric, that physicists are actually taking a serious look at over the last couple of years. Are we absolutely certain that we are not living in a massive computer simulation?
Right.
And it initially sounds wild, but when you look at where our technology is going and where even our computer gaming is going, where we have games like No Man's Sky, which have basically created their own computer universes, is it really that big of a stretch to think a more advanced civilization couldn't do the same? So some people think the reason it's not coming out is that it's way deeper and way more upsetting than, hey, there's little gray guys with big black eyes that live on this other planet. It's something fundamental to our existence here that we would struggle to handle.
Yeah, and that's entirely possible. That goes down the physics rabbit hole, of course, but we absolutely could be a simulation. And people have said we are a smear on the rim of the black hole too. You know, we're actually. I heard one physics theory which we were actually a two-dimensional smear, which is impossible to believe, wrap your head around it, but there's just so much in terms of reality, and that's probably another show for another time.
Sure.
But Jim, let's talk a little bit about Roswell. Obviously that's on it's part of the American vernacular now, and it's obviously on probably most of the listeners and viewers' brains at the moment because it's the most famous.
It's the granddaddy of them all.
It's the granddaddy,
It is.
So I'm interested in understanding the story better, but also understanding who brought it to prominence, because I think that happened recently, right, in the last 20, 30 years. Is that correct?
Yeah, what's interesting is the actual event happened around July 3rd, 1947, and people today sort of assume this was a really big deal at the time, but it wasn't. The military, after an initial gaffe, which we can talk about, covered it up so effectively.
Well, what was Roswell? Let's just break it all the way down.
Sure.
So let's assume that someone's never heard of it before.
Absolutely.
And because it's such a monumental event in ufology.
It is. So July 3rd, 1947, a number of air bases pick up an object that is moving somewhat erratically, and they actually tracked it for a very long period, probably upwards of 24 hours.
Okay.
And one of the 4 or 5 cover stories that the government floated in the years that followed was that it was either a weather balloon or it was a Project Mogul balloon, which were slightly more secret clusters of balloons that the U.S. would use to monitor for nuclear blasts from Russia.
Okay.
But the actual radar operators at the time, like a man named Steve McKenzie, basically said, look, if this had been a weather balloon, my superiors would have told me just to actually ignore it. Mm-hmm. So during a lightning storm, at least one thing crashes. And I have to preface it by saying at least one thing, because some Roswell researchers believe this may have actually been a mid-air collision of 2 different objects.
Okay.
Because we know we have at least 2 crash sites. One crash site is found the next day by a rancher named Mac Brazel, and it covers a couple hundred square yards, and it's pieces of very, very lightweight material that could not be cut or burned. Brazel himself, though, did not actually describe seeing a craft with extraterrestrials in it. But there was a second crash site where some campers and a field geologist whose name is C. Curry Holden, who was doing an excavation there at the time, stumbled upon that actually showed not a classic flying saucer design, but what they almost described as a craft with a bat wing trailing edge that was lodged in the side of a cliff. And they said that through the portholes, they could see at least 2 dead tiny pilots inside and at least 1 outside. So right away, that leads to different theories. Some think this was a mid-air collision of 2 crafts in a lightning storm. And, you know, skeptics often say, well, if these UFOs are so advanced, if they can travel from other star systems, how in the world are they accidentally crash landing? One of the theories is actually, at the time in the Southwest U.S., the Army was testing a new type of radar technology. And it was probably so primitive relative to what an advanced civilization would have that it's like they may not have even been guarding against it anymore. And there was some disturbance, and either 2 collided and crashed separate places, or 1 collided, hit the ground. That's the area that Rancher Mac Brazel found. And then it skips and then it lands a couple miles away. And that's the actual crash site.
Okay.
So if you all think about the time period, this is 1947. World War II just ended a short time ago. Patriotism is high. Everybody wants to do their part as a quote-unquote good American and basically report what they see to the government. So Brazel gathers up a number of pieces of this crash material, takes it home to show his family. And then he then contacts the local Roswell Army airfield because the Air Force is not quite in existence. And out comes with him a major named Jesse Marcel. And if you actually look at the whole Roswell story, Marcel appears to have been a very good man. He was interested in the truth. He wanted to get this out. He goes back to the area with Brazel. They gather up some of the debris. Marcel takes some home to show his own family. And his son described that it was lightweight material. It looked like aluminum foil, but it was very different. He said he brought home a big piece that covered their entire dining room table. But you couldn't tear it like aluminum foil, and you basically could crunch it up into a tiny ball, and then he would just drop it on the table and watch it fold itself back out with no wrinkles at all. Now, today we might liken that to what we call a memory metal. Memory metals are fairly new today, but back in 1947, nothing existed.
Right.
They also had beams of what they described looking like a lightweight balsa wood without any grains, but it couldn't be cut or burned, and it had weird hieroglyphic-like writing on it. So Marcel then basically takes out an actual crew of military or soldiers as a search party. allegedly finds the actual crash site. And he is actually the first to announce that the Army had recovered a flying disc.
Right.
Because the whole mythology of Roswell has become so ingrained, people sort of assume that from the start, the military said it was a crashed weather balloon, and they did not. The day it happened, Marcel actually reports that they have a flying disc.
Because there was a newspaper article.
There was in the Roswell Daily Record, and you can still see pictures of it online. So this is right during the first big flying saucer craze in America, because the famous Kenneth Arnold sighting was only like a couple weeks previous to that. So the media pounces on it. The Roswell media goes crazy. They descend on Roswell, and then we could maybe argue this is one of the first real government cover-ups.
Okay.
The government descends. Phone calls out of Roswell are cut off at the switchboard. All of the local Roswell media officials are basically herded into the radio station, and they're told that in no uncertain terms, if they continue to report this quote-unquote false rumor that is the last time they'll ever work in journalism, they faced at least 25 years worth of prison time, if not more. So then the whole story starts to change. And Colonel Blanchard comes in, and he actually starts to lead the cover-up. They take the rancher Marcel. They take him away from his family. They hold him for a full 8 days without any legal representation.
Okay.
They then march him out in front of the press, and they have him say that the debris was actually found in the middle of June and consisted of nothing more than string, paper, and some tape, like what you would see of a kite. And Marcel himself actually gets somewhat discredited. They actually took the crash debris to Fort Bliss, Texas. And we mentioned that before because that was one of the first stops of the Nazis during Operation Paperclip. And according to Marcel, he didn't contradict the official story at the time. But according to Marcel, in later years after he had retired, he had the real crash debris in the room. The military then came in, took all that debris out, and then brought in pieces of what was clearly just a kite or some type of weather balloon. They then herded the media into the room and started to take pictures. And if you actually look at the pictures of Marcel, he looks kind of dumbfounded. Right. And he said he was basically embarrassed having to hold up pieces of what was clearly a kite or a weather balloon.
Right.
So if you want a great account of the Roswell crash, there's two good places. Eric, I don't know if you've ever read, hands down, my favorite all-encompassing book on extraterrestrials is Alien Agenda by Jim Marrs. It's phenomenal.
Okay.
He has at least 30-some eyewitnesses to the Roswell crash, including people that actually recovered the extraterrestrial bodies and assisted in flying them to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio.
Talk about that. That's what. So supposedly that's what happened. So when they went and they recaptured or they collected data from the supposed crash site.
Yes.
Bodies were recovered then?
Yes. Allegedly, as the story goes, there were 3 bodies that were recovered. 2 dead extraterrestrials and 1 live extraterrestrial. Now, the U.S. military actually did try to address this, but they made the story worse.
Okay.
They actually said those weren't alien bodies, they were crash test dummies that we were using with the Project Mogul balloons. And there were 2 big problems with this, and they showed pictures of the crash test dummies.
Okay.
The number one problem is the Air Force did not actually use crash test dummies until 1955. This happened in 47. But the other big problem is, why in the world are you putting a crash test dummy on a weather balloon? So the military has changed their story, I would say, no less than 4 or 5 times. And what's crazy to me is the most ridiculous explanations will be accepted by the mainstream media if they don't involve aliens. Like one of the ones that came out most recently, which I found highly discredited, is they claimed it wasn't actually aliens. They were high-altitude skydivers whose pressure suits malfunctioned, causing their heads to swell up as they descended rapidly through the atmosphere. And this was actually proposed by a female author who'd written a skeptical book on Roswell. But because it didn't involve aliens, they went with it. So let's talk about the actual alien bodies. One of the best stories that comes out, Eric, was from the mortuary officer at Ballard's funeral home in Roswell, the mortician. His name was Glenn Dennis. And around July 4th or July 5th, he actually got a hurried call from Roswell Army Airfield that asked him if he had a number of small child caskets that could be hermetically sealed. And he figured there was a horrible accident that happened somewhere in the area. And then the Roswell base officer asked an even more bizarre question. He asked Dennis, how do you prepare bodies that have been left out in the elements for a time or even eaten a little bit by animals, which he found very bizarre. He had a nurse friend that contacted him a few days later in a panic, and she told him when they went out to dinner that she was actually called in to assist in the autopsy of 3 quote-unquote foreign bodies that gave off an overpowering odor. She said they were very small with large heads and eyes. She said they had webbing between their 4 fingers, and their 4 fingers ended in suction cup-like tips. And what's interesting is after she shared this story with Dennis, she was suddenly transferred without warning to an air base in England. And Dennis tried to correspond with her through letters. He tried to make a phone call, and he never heard back from her. And it turned out a few days after she got there, she was killed by a hit-and-run driver, and nobody ever found the driver. So some believe she was silenced. So a number of women have come out who were secretaries at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. That's the home of the legendary Hangar 18,
right,
where they supposedly have this huge underground complex. And they were initially told that a plane was arriving with alien bodies, which they initially took to assume illegal aliens, people from outside the country. But they were then corrected in understanding that this was actually extraterrestrials from another planet. And very soon after, an officer came around and said that was just a rumor, but anybody reporting the quote-unquote rumor would be subject again to a fine and 25 years in prison. So many of these people kept quiet for decades, but after they retired, after their security oaths finally were expired, they shared their stories.
So, was there also a pastor, or was there a man of the cloth who was called in to give last rites, or am I blending stories there?
That's a great question. I think we are upwards of 300 eyewitnesses who had some personal experience with Roswell. To the best of my knowledge, though, I have not read about a pastor called in to administer rites. I will say the one account I can think of is 1897, during the first airship wave in the Southwest United States. There was an airship, which sounds a lot today like a UFO, that actually crashed in Aurora, Texas. It hit a windmill owned by a Judge Proctor and exploded and landed by his water well. And there was an article carried in the newspaper that the town held a quote-unquote Christian burial for the pilot, who is not of this world, and it was buried in a local cemetery. So that's a whole side story, but that's the closest I've heard to an alien receiving last rites. It could have happened in the Roswell case, but I've just never heard it.
Okay, before we talk about Philip Corso, there's another story that I had heard about, that a rancher or farmer had disposed of what they suspected was an alien craft metal in a well. Was that connected to Roswell at all?
That is Aurora, Texas. And what's interesting is, based on the newspaper account...
But they got sick. The well made them sick.
And it still does today. So Judge Proctor's windmill was right beside this water well. And some believe that the rancher who owned the land basically threw pieces of the craft down the water well. Others believe that the propulsion system of the craft, whatever it was somewhat radioactive. But to this day at that site, no grass will grow, and people cannot drink the water from that well because it's poisoned. But that's a great story with a cover-up of the alien pilot who is supposedly buried in a local cemetery there. That's Aurora, Texas, 1897.
So does Philip Corso enter the UFO vernacular through Roswell? Was he one of the military officers who got a glimpse of the potential bodies there?
Philip Corso, it is an amazing story. If you have not heard about Philip Corso, listeners or viewers, you need to read up on this man. This is basically an Army colonel that is connected to some of the most seminal events in American history from that golden era from the 40s through the 60s. You see his name crop up time and time again, even in places you wouldn't expect. Like, he was personally assigned to investigate the Kennedy assassination. So he just appears all over the place. Philip Corso co-wrote a book with Bill Burns from the History Channel. He was on UFO Hunters. He's been on Ancient Aliens. And it is called The Day After Roswell. Now, I will say I have the book. I actually have it signed by Phil Corso Jr., as sadly Sr. passed away in the early 2000s. And due to a chance occurrence, I got to spend an evening with his grandson. And the overall book is good, but I have to tell you, Eric, the first 2 chapters, when they talk about, they set the imagery for that stormy night in Roswell, it is some of the best reading you'll ever see on ufology. So Corso was involved in basically taking this UFO crash material and eventually getting it out to industry so that they could work on it. And that's what he details in The Day After Roswell. Now, as I say this over the air, people listening probably think, well, that's totally ridiculous. There's no way that the military or intelligence agencies would actually take UFO crash debris and give them to anybody outside of the intelligence agencies. But here's Corso's take, and it's very simple and very interesting. He said within the military, within intelligence apparatuses, there was so much red tape and regulation, it was tough for them to make as rapid of progress as they could out in commercial industry.
Sure.
So he basically worked out of Washington, and he had a series of contacts. Now, what's interesting is how he would actually distribute this crash material. He claimed that he would take different pieces to different contacts. He would not tell them it came from the crash of a flying saucer. He would basically say, hey, we've been working on this. It's a little bit farther along than what you guys are already working on. Why don't you take this and just go with it? And the benefit to the United States and to the military is when they would make this progress, the military could then benefit by incorporating it into their own technology. And this program continues today. Linda Moulton Howe actually unearthed it. If you want to, you can Google the CARET program, C-A-R-E-T. It stands for Commercial Applications of Extraterrestrial Technology, and it's supposedly used today. Okay. Now, a number of people, including some UFO researchers, have attacked Corso's claims. For example, Corso claims that the reason we have the laser is because one was recovered at the Roswell crash. They found a handheld device that basically shot a very concentrated beam of light, and according to Corso, that's where we get the laser. But noted ufologist, the late Stanton Friedman, attacked that, and he said, no, I know the men who were working on developing the laser at the time. For you to just say we just happened into this by aliens, it is insulting to them, and it discredits all their work. But Corso's accounts are very detailed. According to him, we got a boost with lasers, night vision, computers, semiconductors, an enormous boost from the Roswell crash. And sure enough, 1947 was a very big year. Transistor technology exploded tenfold. We have the creation suddenly of the United States Air Force. By September of 47, we have the creation of the United Nations. And so if it is a coincidence, it's one heck of a coincidence that all this went down during that time.
Look at the time frame and the acceleration through the invention of the transistor, just what that has done to computers and society in general. That was the gateway that opened up all the modern conveniences of our life.
Oh, absolutely. And even, to put in perspective, by the early Mercury program, computers are in their infancy. NASA is still primarily doing everything on slide rules. The first computers took up entire rooms. And then, by the end of the shuttle program, they're tiny and handheld. They were doing millions, now billions of calculations a second. I mean, the acceleration has been phenomenal.
And that single fact is hard for me to wrap my head around, Jim, that we have not gone back, because it should be an afterthought now, I would think, in 2020 to go to the moon when it was 51 years ago.
You're right.
We landed there for the first time, supposedly, right?
And, it's not just to do it for patriotism, Eric. A goal of any civilization, if we want to live long enough, you have to start expanding out.
No question.
Earth can only hold so many people. Even our own sun is not eternal. As early as 4 billion years from now, it's going to run out of hydrogen to fuse.
And we know that.
We know this. It's going to start fusing helium. And if we can't find a way to physically move the Earth away from the sun, and they already do have one idea on the drawing board about that, but the sun is eventually going to engulf us whole. So it's imperative, even beyond patriotism, it's imperative as a civilization, we have to start expanding outwards. And publicly, we haven't done that since 1972.
Talk a little bit about Stanton Friedman. Just as someone who has been fascinated by UFOs, his name continually has always been in the landscape.
It has.
Of a lot of stories. And he's been a critic as well, too. I think he was a critic of Corso.
He was.
And correct me if I'm wrong, he's a big critic of Bob Lazar.
He is. And so
and we just lost Stanton recently, didn't we?
We did a couple years ago.
Yeah.
So probably most of you, if you're at all interested in UFOs, you have seen Stanton Friedman. If you've ever watched a special on the History Channel where there's an older gentleman with big bushy eyebrows and wire rim glasses and a beard, that's Stanton Friedman. I would say he is probably one of the most credible, well-respected UFO researchers ever. He was most famous for his book called Top Secret Magic, MAJIC. He actually started as a nuclear physicist. He worked at Bell Labs. And what's interesting is on his way out to his job, he's driving cross country to get there, and he hears over the radio that there had been major layoffs at Bell Labs. So as he's driving to go to his job, he finds out that he can't actually even get to his job. But he's very brilliant, and he does a number of jobs as a nuclear physicist, but he had a side interest in UFOs. And if you read his sort of origin story in his books, he basically started to lecture more and more to different groups that were interested in UFOs. He even lived here in Western Pennsylvania for a time. And it got to the point, and he was fascinated enough, he basically just embarked on a second career as a UFO researcher.
Right.
So his main contributions deal with the Majestic 12 documents. Are you familiar?
I want to go there. Yeah.
Okay. I feel like I'm talking too much.
No,
Can you give like any...
my friend, you're doing great.
Okay.
Doing great.
So the basic gist with the Majestic 12 documents. Majestic 12 was allegedly a top secret group established by President Truman in 1947, same year as the Roswell crash, to research the UFO phenomenon. And there have been a couple documents that have come out that are very controversial. One is called the Cutler-Twining Memo, but probably the biggest one was about a 30-page document which basically laid out for agents within Majestic 12 on how to actually conduct a UFO crash recovery, how to float false cover stories to the media, how to secure the site, and even, this is pretty spectacular, it shows diagrams of the 4 or 5 types of crafts they had at the time. It lists the 2 different types of extraterrestrials they had recovered and encountered at the time. And the fancy term was EBE 1 and 2, extra biological entity. And what's really fascinating to me about the documents is they actually list, and this just goes to show the Cold War tension at the time, the United States' biggest fear at the time wasn't actually the extraterrestrials themselves. It was the potential of this technology falling into the hands of other countries like the Soviet Union.
Right.
Now, this huge document never actually appears in physical form. It shows up as a couple rolls of film in a manila envelope on the doorstep of a Hollywood movie producer, I believe named Jamie Shandera. And so that caused a lot of skeptics to say, well, come on, like, how shady is that
Cloak looking dagger stuff.
Right, exactly. Right. Like, he just happens to be a Hollywood movie producer. But what a lot of people didn't know is he's also a very accomplished amateur ufologist and had a big interest in it. So the film is developed. And long story short, a number of people attacked it and said, this has to be a hoax. The United States did not use that typewriter font at the time.
Right, I've seen exposés on
They
that.
did not use that date format. And what Friedman did, he wasn't out in the field looking for UFOs. He spent a lot of time in presidential libraries, Library of Congress, different databases. And sure enough, he has been able to prove definitively with other government declassified memos that every one of those fonts existed at the time.
Right.
Each of those date formats was
Right.
used. So he's a phenomenal researcher. I got to present with him in later years, and I got to meet him. I will say I was far more impressed with him than he was with me, but it was still great to actually meet him.
He was always fascinating because I thought he was so eloquent in the way he spoke that he lent ufology credibility just by him speaking, period, number one. Number two, he also was not afraid to, to tell you when he was skeptical.
Absolutely.
Right?
So it's a very balanced approach, and it comes from a man who had a prior career of high credibility. Because
man of science.
Absolutely. And that's what hurts ufology is, and I'm not going to take an elite approach like, well, we should only have, well-trained scientists, because I think anybody can be fascinated in the phenomenon, and I think anybody can be a really good researcher. But when you have people not coming from that background, they make a number of mistakes. They jump to a number of conclusions that can be disproven, and that really hurts the field on the whole. And Stanton Friedman was very, very careful to back up all of his claims that he made.
Where do you stand personally on the abduction phenomenon?
The abduction phenomenon is fascinating. And for those of you who are just hearing this for the first time and thinking, well, what's that mean? Alien abductions is one of the most controversial aspects of ufology. According to some, upwards of thousands of people every single night are either taken against their will from their bedrooms or out of their stalled out cars on the side of the road. They're whisked aboard some type of extraterrestrial craft. Biological samples are taken. It's a rather traumatizing experience for some. For others, it's highly spiritual. And then these people are basically put right back in their cars, right back in their beds, and their memories are wiped of this, the so-called missing time. And then they wake up the next morning not knowing what happened. So I've done a lot of research into it, and I'm very careful on who I present it to, because the idea can be very upsetting. And if we have the time for it,
sure,
I can outline basically 3 different theories for it.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
So one theory of alien abductions is that this is very nuts and bolts. It is actually happening in our physical world. And probably one of the biggest proponents for that is actually a Harvard professor named Dr. David Jacobs, who you see in a number of History Channel programs. He's a man, wire-rimmed glasses, gray mustache, speaks very well. And Harvard, Jacobs probably drives them nuts that he is there. But to his credit, his research has been rock solid. Over the last 20 years, he has done what is called regression hypnosis to try to uncover that missing time with people. And I got to listen to him at a conference, and I spoke to him a little bit afterwards. And his take is that this is very, very nuts and bolts. Because one of the theories I proposed to him, I said, well, Dr. Jacobs, is there a chance that nobody can seem to record an abduction happening? Because like today, Eric, everybody has smartphones. You'd think somebody would be able to get one of these. I said, is there a chance that nobody is recording these because an advanced civilization can basically manipulate time? They can stretch out and slow down time during this event, but then rapidly collapse it. So from our perspective, only a second or two has been lost. He said no. In his opinion, if a witness recalls being on a craft for 2 hours, their family literally cannot find them for 2 hours. Sometimes when they show back up, they wake up out in their yard. Their outside doors are locked. They can't get back into their house. Sometimes they will wake up wearing clothes that are not even their clothes. So for him, it is very, very physical. Other people think that this is more spiritual. Some skeptics have said this is not actually happening, despite the amazing consistency of reports from people all around the world. They'll say this is just a mass hallucination. This is a mental phenomenon. And there have been cases where people have essentially been unconscious and their friends are trying to wake them up. Their bodies are physically there, and when they wake up, they swear they have had an abduction experience. But there's also, Eric, a smaller amount of what I call hybrid accounts. And these are really fascinating because they really blur our reality. And I'll just give you one of my favorites. There is an abduction story where 2 women are driving down the road late at night. I believe this is back in the 1980s. They're by themselves, deserted section of road, and they see a bright light coming down right in front of them. The woman in the passenger seat says to her friend, "Don't worry, I know they're here for me. Just pull your car off the side of the road. Everything's going to be just fine." So for her friend with white knuckles at the steering wheel is looking at her like wide-eyed, like, what are you talking about? She pulls her car off the road, though. She says the craft lands, a door opens up, and a couple small beings in silver flight suits get out. Her friend exits the car and goes up and talks to them while she is sitting there at the wheel and her headlights are still illuminating the scene. Now, this is where this gets wild, and this is why I call this a hybrid account. She claimed that she saw a ghost image of her friend separate from her friend's physical body. It goes onto the craft with the beings, who then leave. She then sits there for a half hour, still seeing her friend physically in front of her, seemingly now talking to nobody at all. But she's petrified and won't get out of the car. She then claimed the craft came back. Ghost image of her friend comes off, reunites with the physical body, and she gets back into the car. So part of the reason it's tough for dedicated researchers to get at the heart of the phenomenon is not only is there such a big variety, but if you go on YouTube today and Google or you search alien abduction, real alien abduction, still to this day, there is not one good piece of definitive footage that shows it's definitely happening. So a lot of people will just say, well, that's nuts. There's no way it's real. But if you actually read the accounts of some of these people and the remarkable consistencies of them, I think it's a lot more likely that there's some phenomenon going on. But despite having 70 years worth of cases now, it's still tough for me to pinpoint exactly what it is.
The movie Fire in the Sky was extremely compelling to me. Now, I know that version of the story was done for Hollywood.
It was.
But and the gentleman's name escapes me right
Travis
now.
Walton.
Travis Walton.
It's so funny you bring that movie up.
I would love to sit down and talk to Travis Walton for a couple hours.
I've met him. He did a conference. He's fantastic.
Yeah, because I can't imagine, after hearing him speak, separate from the movie, just watching presentations with him, he just seems so credible. And of course, we really never know, but it seems you really want to believe this guy's story.
You do. It's funny you bring up that movie because I always joke, like back in the 90s when I'm a teenager, that was like my secret date movie because that movie is freaking terrifying.
It's terrifying. I also think that movie was kind of ahead of its time, maybe not in special effects, but it was really... And it did not get the play. It was almost like it was being suppressed somehow.
Yes, and if you think about it, and this really blows my mind, how few movies are there today that actually give a quote-unquote realistic depiction of gray aliens? It hardly ever happens. Even today, we're still given the kind of cartoony Hollywood aliens. Or yeah, exactly. Or we're just given aliens for like a split second at the end of the movie. And to me, that's interesting because I feel like if a movie did use that type of aliens, like Fire from the Sky, it could be truly terrifying.
I thought that movie, I couldn't sleep. And I stumbled across that movie, too,
yes.
When it first came out. I was glad I didn't go to theaters and see that. I really would have been horrified.
Oh, my gosh. Well, you know, Walton is one of the few abductees because skeptics will say, well, they're just saying this because they want money. And that hasn't been the case. For most abductees, it's a very traumatizing experience. And if they do go to counseling, they have symptoms very similar to people who have suffered physical abuse.
Can you share the story? Can you talk about the story?
I would be happy to. See, I'm always nervous. Like, I don't want to talk too much on your show.
My friend, this is your show, pal.
Right.
I'm honored you're here. Thank you, Jim.
No problem. Well, I'm sure for some of your listeners, like, if they do listen to this type of stuff, they follow UFOs, they know the whole story, but some might not. So here's the basic story. I believe this happened around 1976 in outside a little town called Snowflake, Arizona. So Walton is part of a logging crew of 6 men that was working for the Forestry Service, and they were very well behind on their contract. So they were working late into the woods one night. They finally all piled into his friend's extended cab pickup truck and bounced down this logging road to finally leave the wood after a long day. And Walton is a very young man at this time. I believe he's only about 19. So up ahead over the crest of a hill, they see the sky lit up bright red, which initially they assumed was a forest fire that they were about to drive into. But upon cresting the hill, to their shock, they see what looks like a UFO, a flying saucer, hovering above the field, and the light has now changed to a blue. Suddenly, without telling his friends, Walton jumps out of the truck and runs into the middle of the clearing and looks up at the UFO. And his friends are pleading at him to come back, but they're too terrified to get out and go get him. And so the UFO is hovering silently. He's gazing up at it. And then suddenly, without warning, it strikes Walton right in the chest with a beam of light and knocks him back into the underbrush. His friends freak out and drive away, leaving Travis there with the UFO. They left him. So
some friends,
Oh my gosh. So a couple miles down the logging road, they say to themselves, what are we doing? He's just a kid. What cowards we are. We left there. We have to go back for him. So they stop. They get the truck turned around. They go back to the clearing. Walton is gone. They look for flashlights. They can't find his body anywhere. And so is the UFO. The men immediately go back into town and tell the sheriff the exact story, and they're separated and all their stories match. Now, initially, the police assumed this was a homicide. They thought that the other men had murdered Walton, and they constructed this ridiculous cockamamie story about a UFO to try to cover that up.
Right.
But all of their stories matched. They all passed lie detector tests.
That's the thing.
How about that?
To me, that's the, and again, I know it's not admissible in a court of law as if we sit here, correct? But technology is what it is, and they've had that technology figured out for decades. Yep. The fact that they all passed.
If it was some type of hoax, you'd think one of them would have slipped up.
Absolutely,
one of them would not pass.
Absolutely,
and even
right.
to this day, they've all held to their story, yet still no Travis. So finally, and here's where the stories diverge a little bit, but the count that I like best, about 3 days later, his mother receives a collect phone call. It's Travis. He's got a couple days of stubble growing on his face. I read one account that said he was totally naked, his clothes were gone, and he's calling her dehydrated and malnourished from a payphone outside of town. Now, unlike a lot of abductees, Travis Walton did not have missing time. He remembered his experience very vividly. So once he's finally back and they nurse him back to health, he actually shares his story. Do we have time to talk about that?
Absolutely.
So while he's gone, Walton comes to, and he recalls being in what looked like a small interrogation room, like what police officers would use. There was a table in it and perhaps a chair. He then, to his shock, sees 3 beings come into the room in what looked like red one-piece flight suits, and they were clearly not human. Most depictions show them looking very similar to gray aliens. Thinking quickly and terrified out of his mind, he sees what looks like a pipe in the room, and he picks it up and holds it above him in a menacing fashion. The beings then leave the room and run out. So eventually, and this almost reminds me of Han Solo in the original Star Wars, like running after the stormtroopers down the Death Star. He runs after the beings and finds himself in a large, slowly curving hallway. To his right, he goes into the inner part of the circle that the hallway made, and he finds himself on what looks like the bridge of a spaceship. And the ceiling is domed almost like a planetarium, and he sees tiny chairs. And he sees what looks like a control panel. And keep in mind, given the date of this, computers were still not really big yet.
76.
And he said he described what almost looked like touchscreen technology. He saw small indentations for 4-fingered hands. He put his own 5-fingered hands over the indentations, and suddenly the whole dome lit up like a star field. He then began to move his hands back and forth over the panel, and the entire room would shift, which he said made him feel nauseous. So he pulls his hands back, and the whole dome goes dark again. He then returns to the curved hallway, and he then finds an exit off the opposite side of the hallway and goes down a ramp. Now, as far as I know, Eric, this is the only abduction account I've ever read where something like this happens. To his shock, he is in either a huge hangar or the body of a much larger ship, and he sees his flying saucer and other ones parked in a row. He then sort of slowly journeys across this big expanse and then finds what looks like what he describes as a laboratory where human scientists are working. And he tries to talk to him, but he says he was very frustrated because nobody wanted to listen to him. They were just ignoring him. Finally, he described a very muscular man with long blonde hair coming into the room, and in plain English barked at him, hey, what are you doing in here? You're not supposed to be awake. He grabs Travis in a bear hug. Travis passes out. And then when he wakes up, he's at that phone booth outside of town. So you've seen the movie. That's
So
where
different.
it really diverges from the movie. And in later years, Walton said he really regretted essentially giving Hollywood the full rights to the story because they just took it and ran with it a different direction.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. With that movie, they had him like in an incubation area, like in a
Yes.
slimy incubation area that he escaped.
Yes.
Floated up, and then did they grab him and put him on a table, or did they
Yes.
that go black? Or am I getting it in reverse?
You're not. It was so traumatizing to me as a teenager. I remember everything about it.
Okay.
Walton wakes up in some type of hive.
Yes.
Like, think about bees making a hive. He escapes from the embryo, like you said, and finds himself in microgravity. So he's floating through the hive and can see into the cells and different body parts of other human beings. The gray extraterrestrials then grab him after he kicks a spacesuit that looks like an alien with a gray helmet with the bigger eyes.
Right.
So that was kind of one of the interesting twists the movie does. It shows the aliens with more human eyes, but the big black eyes were just on their spacesuits. They then drag him down this dirty hallway, and that's where the really scary part comes in. They put him on an exam table. They put this piece of plastic
saran
over top
wrap
of him.
or something.
That
It melts to
freezes
him,
him.
yeah.
They then cut a hole in the plastic around his eye, and it's this bizarre scene where they just slowly lower a needle into his eyeball, and he's screaming out. And there are needles in some abduction accounts, but never in that one. And so that's where Hollywood really took liberties and ran with it. But it's a terrifying sequence.
Yeah, no
to
question,
watch.
no question. It's horrific. And I've always looked back at that as being, how could that story not have gotten more traction in society?
Right. And, even he's actually done a good bit of science behind it, where they actually went back out to that clearing and they actually took tree ring samples, and all the trees that were basically facing the UFO at the time had grown at a much more highly accelerated rate than the ones that were facing away. Now, he presented this to us, and I thought, well, skeptically, maybe you could say, yeah, Travis, but the trees that are on the edge of the clearing might get more sunlight than the ones deeper back in the woods, so they would grow faster. But I mean, even to his credit, he has tried to do a lot of his own research to substantiate it. And I got to tell you, when he presented, Eric, not only was it a powerful presentation, but even all these decades later, he still gets broken up telling the story. And I mean,
bet.
this man was sincere. Like, this was not alligator tears just putting it on. Like, he legitimately struggled to get through that story even to this day.
What's horrific, and even if Hollywood embellished it, it sounds like the story that you're telling would have been a better one.
I
the
think
actual
so.
story from him would have made a better film.
Absolutely. And I mean, the huge plot twist of being in a bigger hangar, maybe of like a cigar-shaped ship, and actually seeing humans on board working with extraterrestrials, that story actually ties in very closely to what a lot of people have supposedly encountered when they've been at Area 51. And I think it would be a much more compelling story.
Talk a bit about cattle mutilation or animal mutilation too, because you'll laugh. The very first time I saw a field that was carved, what do they call that?
Crop circle.
Crop circle was on the cover of a Led Zeppelin
Oh, yeah, I know
compilation
that album,
in
yeah.
1990.
Right.
Like, what is this, right? So, not all crop circles have been debunked, right? There's been fraud in some,
Correct.
but not all of them, because of their intricacy and their precision nature,
Yes.
and the speed in which they are not there and then there.
Yes.
Mankind can't do that.
We could go either direction you want. We can either go the crop circle path or the cattle mutilation path, but they're slightly different things. So at least
I
for
want them
now-
both. So let's
Okay.
just start with crop circles.
Okay. So crop circles, the media was very interested in the early 80s. Most of them were appearing in farm fields in England, and not just wheat field, but soybeans, rapeseed, corn, barley, lots of different fields. But then two elderly British gentlemen named Dan and Dave came forward, and they claimed to the British media they were responsible for all the crop circles in England, and it was a simple hoax. And they actually brought the media out to a local farm field, and they showed how they did it. They would basically take flattened boards with holes drilled at each end. They would then take a thick gauge piece of rope, put them through the holes, and knot it at the bottom. They would then put the rope on their foot and hold the rope taut with their hands. And basically they could walk around in circles and make a small press circle in the field. So the British media is sitting there filming the thing, and they released it. And so then the mainstream media, even here in the United States, lost interest. According to them, all crop circles were these pranks by Dan and Dave.
Which, on the premise there, that's impossible.
Impossible. So there are a lot of really compelling cases about crop circles. I think your assessment is exactly true. Some have been proven hoaxes, but there are so many elaborate things about them that it's almost impossible for humans to do. Let me just give at least like a couple things that are tough to explain. People think this is a recent phenomenon, and it is not. The earliest recorded crop circle at least goes back to 1672. There was a British paper called like the Hertfordshire, and they described them as mowing devils. And on this newspaper, you can still see it online, the illustration on the front shows Satan with his sickle and his horns and his creepy little cloven hoof feet. And he is in a field, but if you look at the overall pattern made in the field, it looks a heck of a lot like a crop circle. And so this is a much more ancient phenomenon. Today, crop circles have appeared in almost every country on Earth, although most of them still appear in England, but we get them in the United States. So Dan and Dave have been dead for decades. So skeptics might say, well, it's just the followers of Dan and Dave that continue to make these hoaxes. But there's a lot of things about quote unquote real crop circles that we just can't do to this day. As you alluded to, Eric, we're going to see, just like with cattle mutilations, a number of crop circles will happen in a matter of minutes and in broad daylight. So a farmer drives by his or her field, everything is normal. They drive back through, and suddenly there's an enormous crop circle. And we use the term crop circle singular, but a lot of these things are actually aggregates of hundreds of different circles.
Like glyphs almost.
Glyphs, advanced geometric designs. Some of them are called fractals, which is a high concept in mathematics, where you basically take one shape, like a circle, and you repeat it at bigger and bigger and bigger, or smaller and smaller increments. There have been some in England that have spanned 6 or 7 football fields containing literally over 300 individual circles. They're perfectly symmetrical. Animals will behave wildly both before and after a circle is made. So if we think about teenagers just sneaking out to a field with some boards, that wouldn't happen. People who go inside crop circles to try to get up close pictures, a lot of times they're disappointed because their computers or cell phones will get fried by like a resident magnetic field that's left. Speaking of magnetism, the grains in a real crop circle will get suddenly attracted to magnets. Even the stalks of wheat, this would be one of the most difficult things to hoax. And years ago, Mythbusters even tried to fake a crop circle that was recorded in the time frame it was recorded in, which was like a half an hour. Not only could they not make the grains magnetic, but when you make a fake crop circle, you're actually going to break the stalks of wheat or whatever.
Saw that.
So in a real one, none of the stalks are actually broken. They are bent over what is called their nodal points. And I read a good book by a skeptical scientist. The only way scientists have been able to replicate this is by actually microwaving stalks of wheat or what have you. Because when you do that, it'll make the tiny amount of water in the stalk boil, the node will puff up, and then it will lose its rigidity, flop over, and continue to grow sideways. And so a number of these crop circles up close, the flattened grains are actually interwoven like a bushel basket. Who could ever do that? And you might think, well, the farmer's upset because he or she is losing the farm field. They're not. Not only does the crop circle actually start to grow more rapidly than the grain around it, but the following year, there are actually ghost images of the circle left in the field because it continues to grow faster. Researchers have found what they call altered quartz. So something happens to quartz grains, very common on the surface of Earth, inside these crop circles that for some reason makes them function like a very good fertilizer. And so part of me thinks, What if another civilization is thinking, hey, human beings, your worldwide population is over 8 billion. Most people on your planet can't get enough to eat. Here's an easy way to use quartz as a fertilizer so you can gain more food, but we're just missing it. Just real quick, Eric, a number of crop circles have actually not only displayed fractal mathematics, but mathematical theorems that had never been known before.
Wow.
And so if these are hoaxers, they're absolutely brilliant hoaxers.
But why? Like, why? It's such a huge undertaking. I can
It
understand
is.
to go and hoax something, but make it something that's not so much labor intensive. It's
You're right.
crazy chore.
You're
That's
right.
that's someone's life work there.
It
right?
is.
I mean, come on.
And, you know, even speaking of labor intensive, it's almost like whoever is doing them is thinking to themselves, okay, humans, you think that's a hoax? Now explain this one. Back in the 2000s in Chilbotton, England, a couple really fascinating crop circles surfaced right outside a radio telescope observatory. One looked very similar to the face on Mars, and it was actually done with pixels. There were actually grain crops flattened into individual pixels like on a computer screen. And when you looked at it from above, it looked like this face. Another one actually looked like lines on a television. It actually showed a gray alien holding a disc in its hand, which had ASCII computer code on it that has been translated. But the whole image was not a clean crop circle image. It was actually made with 65 individual lines in the crops that then formed a big image.
Wow.
So even some of these are controversial in the community because even some crop circle believers say, no, that one must be a hoax. The edges aren't clean like a real circle. But I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, somehow somebody made an image making 65 individual lines and they included computer code in it. So it's absolutely fascinating. And the overall belief is governments of the world are corrupt. More advanced civilizations know that if they go to them, that they won't get the eventual disclosure they want. So what they are trying to do is leave messages that are awe-inspiring, that are in harmony with nature, that all of us regular people can see. The sad thing is the media just doesn't cover them. So if you don't go to look for them, you won't find them.
Animal mutilation.
Ugh.
And I just recently did a little deep dive in the Skinwalker Ranch, and that's
Yes.
kind of why my mind's on this now, which I'm still confused on that, too.
Yeah, Skinwalker Ranch is wild, isn't it? A buddy of mine just got me a book on it. Well, animal mutilation. If you wanted to pick one phenomenon that absolutely proves something else is going on here, you would probably pick animal mutilations. They are mostly cattle mutilations. The problem is they're very upsetting, very traumatizing, and the media just won't cover them anymore.
So gory.
Very gory. So here's the quick background. Have you heard of Linda Moulton Howe?
I have heard of Linda, yes.
Probably a lot of people have. If you've ever watched the History Channel, the older woman with the long wavy hair who speaks very eloquently, that's Linda Moulton Howe. She was actually a beauty queen early in life and then became a television reporter for a station out west. And she was a very thorough investigative journalist. And she wrote a book that was called A Strange Harvest. And this is what really brought cattle mutilations to the forefront. So the earliest one on record, even though these have probably been happening for centuries, was not actually with a cow, but it was a farmer's horse named Lady. And I believe this was around 1965 or so. So a farmer is driving through the edge of his field, sees Lady with her foal out in the field. This is broad daylight. Comes back a couple minutes later, and suddenly, I don't believe it was Lady, I believe it was the foal, is totally mutilated. Now, if you're just hearing about these for the first time, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, it could just be a predator, it could have been sick. Here's what really separates cattle mutilations from predation. There are odd things that are inconsistent with predation, Eric. And I've watched a number of accounts from different sides. One of the best I've seen is a group of skeptical scientists thought it was actually predators and the natural action of bacteria. So they took a cow that had died of natural causes, they put it out on the edge of a farm field, and just like you have in your studios here, they put a number of cameras on it to record the cow 24/7.
Right.
So over a couple days, predators came up to it, they munched on different parts of the cow's hide, the meat, and a couple days later, bacteria, as the animal decomposed, started to work small holes in the hide. But what we see in a real mutilation is totally different. For starters, the things you think predators would go for are never gone. So I think predators are a lot like us. Probably to survive, they eat whatever they had to. But if they have a choice, they'll go for the same things we will on a cow. They'll go for the loins, the roasts, the really good stuff. None of that stuff is ever touched. Weird things will be missing. The eyes will be missing. An ear will be missing. The tongue will be missing. The entire reproductive system will be carved out with laser-like precision. In a quote-unquote real mutilation, different labs have actually looked at the margins of the tissues where these holes are, and they have found what they can only dub black peppercorns, which basically means the edge of that margin has basically been turned to charcoal. And the only way that's possible is with some type of cauterizing instrument like a laser. What's also odd about these mutilations, the blood is always totally missing. It hasn't been drained from the body. It's nowhere on the ground. It is entirely
How's
gone.
that possible?
And what's amazing is the animals themselves, they don't exhibit rigor mortis. Even days later, researchers can show up and freely move the arms and the legs. And to answer your question, they say it's almost like some type of anti-clotting serum has been injected into the blood so that the blood can be drained.
But that will leave a trace, which there isn't anything.
There isn't anything. And what's wild is a lot of these happen in really muddy fields. So one explanation was always cults. Back in the 80s, everything was cults, and these are demonic cults doing this. But a lot of times these animals are found in muddy areas of the field. There's no human footprints. There's no predator footprints. Sometimes in a really muddy area, part of their bodies will be sunk down into the ground like they were dropped from a great height. And it's almost like the rest of the herd knows something is up. If one of these happens in a herd, the herd gradually moves away from the animal. They won't go near it. And a lot of times out west, Eric, this will actually happen on Native American reservations. And if it does, the Native Americans just say, this is the work of the Star People. They're to be trusted. They just quickly bury the carcass and they move away from it. So this probably still sounds wild to people, but you also got to look past the fear. And this is costing ranchers like a couple $1,000s a head.
No doubt.
And so there were actually 2 separate FBI investigations launched into the cattle mutilation phenomenon, and both of them simply concluded that they are unexplained. They had no actual explanation for them.
It's horrifying.
It is.
It is horrifying. The precision's what gets me. You think about, could this be, kids out there doing something, but there would be an inherent sloppiness with the procedure.
Yes.
Right?
Now, do you want to hear, speaking of horrifying, I have one abduction case that Jim Mars covers in Alien Agenda that kind of merges the abduction phenomenon and the cattle mutilation.
Yeah, let's hear it.
Okay. So a woman is driving with her kids. This is somewhere out west. I believe this is in the 1970s. And they see over the field in front of them a UFO in the sky. She stops the car and she sees a beam of light coming down from the UFO, and to her shock, it's pulling a cow up into it. The woman then gets very alarmed, and suddenly she's thinking to herself, I should not be seeing this. I should not be seeing this. I am not meant to be here right now. She then blacks out. She wakes up on an examination table. She is in a room with a couple beings, and to her terror, her daughter is on the examination table beside her, and she is unconscious. She then sees the extraterrestrials in front of her with the cow in question. And to her shock, they are using some type of laser cutting tools, and without any emotion at all are just removing parts of this cow. And after she gets over the initial shock, she tries to talk to the beings and say, why are you doing this? And she said initially they were very dismissive of her. She said it almost felt like she was a child and she was trying to get a hold of their parents, but she was bothering them and they didn't want anything to deal with her. But eventually, she said telepathically, they conveyed to her that pollution is working its way up through our ecosystem to higher and higher levels. And as it gets higher, it gets more and more concentrated. And they relayed to her that they would sample from cows because cows surprisingly share quite a lot of human DNA. And so they would sample from these cows to try to test how high up the pollutants were going, because she felt like we were almost at a runaway cycle because of the amount of pollution. So that's one of the few cases I've seen that bridges the two. Other people see far more sinister objectives if these are actually real. And they believe that these other beings are essentially using these cows for some type of raw material, some type of biological material that they themselves need. And bringing us back to Bill Byrne and UFO hunters, talking about terrifying stories, can I quickly share the one story that gets UFO hunters canceled?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Did you ever actually see UFO hunters on the History Channel?
Oh, yeah.
What'd you think of it?
I like the show.
I did too.
I liked it. I thought it had a very slick way of being. The intro was cool.
Yes.
It was weird.
It was.
Quick and weird. Just everything would draw you in.
Yes.
But I thought it was well done.
I did too. And they had a nice balance to the show. If you've never seen it, it was always a group of three. Bill Burns was the most well-known of the three. And Bill was basically the believer. Like everything was extraterrestrials. Then you had Pat, a younger guy who was more skeptical. He would try to think of natural phenomenon. And I feel so bad. I always forget the third man's name, but he had a beard and he was kind of somewhere in between. So there was a nice balance between the group. And they got themselves in trouble over two very controversial episodes.
Okay.
And it's a shame because they actually, for a time, had better ratings than Ancient Aliens. So in season 3, not only did they expose what has been dubbed Area 52, which was the Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah, and they didn't do anything wrong. They actually had all the proper clearances they had to be where they were. But they were still confronted on camera with private security from Dugway that said they could not be there. But the really terrifying episode, and I think this is what got the show canceled, it was the site of a cattle mutilation where a rancher had found a fetus inside the cow that was actually part human and part bovine. And they actually showed pictures of it, and it was terrifying because it looked like essentially a human skull, and then it was covered in what looked like cow hair. Now, I bet for some people listening and watching, you're just like, all right, Jim, like you totally lost me here. But the wild thing about this is they did DNA testing at a respectable lab, and sure enough, it turned out to be a hybrid between a human and a cow. And this was not an urban legend. This actually happened in the state of Colorado, and it actually led Colorado to pass legislation that actually prohibited the hybridization of humans with other animals. This is not a conspiracy. It's very upsetting, but it did happen. It was real. And so some people feel that the show got a little bit too close to a very, very dark truth there. So that's what actually got it canceled after only 3 seasons.
I would think just the way technology, or the rapid way technology has engulfed us, how could we not think that there isn't scientists that would do such things, regardless of how sinister they sound? I mean,
I think you're totally right. And you know, it's kind of unsettling
naive
to me.
To believe it.
Oh, I agree, Eric. Like, even when you look back at Greek and Roman mythology and centaurs and minotaurs, and you think to yourself, that's ridiculous. There's no way that you had the torso of a human and then the body of a horse or all these crossbreeds. But as early as the 1930s, the Nazis were already doing genetic experiments to try to hybridize humans with different animals. Even today, it's never been confirmed, but there are rumors that our military are essentially working on what they would call super soldiers. One example I see is taking certain strands of DNA from spiders and hybridizing that with human DNA to try to give a soldier basically skin that was just absolutely impervious to any type of gunfire. So, you know, I think unfortunately we are at a runaway cycle today. There's an Ancient Aliens episode that they dub it transhumanism. And with all of our technology modifications and DNA modifications, I sadly think we're very close to losing what it means to be truly human.
Oh, there's no, I believe that with just AI. We'll be engulfed by AI. Our generation may not see it, but generations behind us are going to see it. They're going to, in that one question, you know, at what point does AI take control of the human species, and it's going to happen at some point. And we're going
so.
we're going to create that opportunity for AI, which is our creation, anyways.
Right.
They will turn. They will turn on us. It's a matter of time.
It's really scary because really good book by my favorite physicist. Have you heard of Michio Kaku?
Absolutely.
All right. So on any of these shows, if you see the little Asian dude with salt and pepper hair who's just brilliant and hilarious, that's Michio Kaku.
Amazing.
And I read one of his books called Physics of the Impossible. Now, at the time, okay, this was late 90s, early 2000s. We've made many jumps since then. But he said,
absolutely.
At the time, we were actually a lot farther from having robots take over than we think. Because at the time he wrote this, he said, the best neural network we can actually make now is about 6 neurons. And he said that would be about equivalent to the brain of a mosquito. But he said it's not even as good as the brain of a mosquito, because he said a mosquito's brain would have thousands of connections between those neurons, and we can't do that yet. But over the last 20 years, I think things have accelerated rapidly, and some of the computer learning that is going on with some of the companies that Google owns now, like they bought out like Boston Dynamics.
Right.
Not only are they making terrifying things, but there was one really unsettling exchange where 2 of their computers, their supercomputers, start talking back and forth to each other independent of anything the programmers did. And in a matter of minutes, through trial and error, they had basically created their own language that they could understand with each other, but all the humans running the project could not.
That's terrifying.
And the supercomputers would use that language to talk to each other so that the humans didn't know what was going on.
It's terrifying.
It is terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah, terrifying.
It seems to be coming.
Jim, this is amazing.
Thanks, man. This was really fun. Your questions were great.
I've been looking forward to this, and you have exceeded my expectations, my friend.
Thanks, Eric. This was really fun.
Yeah, I would love to have you back on.
Sure.
Please tell our audience how they can reach you and listen to your podcast.
Sure. So our podcast is called Majestic Ears Only. So we've got a Facebook page. You can check that out. We have a website. It's easiest just to Google search Majestic Ears Only. You can also find us for free on podcasts on iTunes and Spreaker and Google Play. We've got about 60-some episodes. It's a nice mix of comedy and conspiracy and the paranormal. I think you'll all like it a lot.
Well, I would love to have you back. There's so many more avenues I want to go. We'd be here for 6 hours, but the pyramids, there's just so many. The Anunnaki, am I pronouncing that?
Anunnaki.
Anunnaki. Who was the pharaoh with the big head?
Oh, that was a good one. That was Akhenaten.
I can't pronounce it. Yeah.
And he was such a controversial. My gosh. Yeah.
There's so many avenues to go down, but I'd love to have you back.
Yeah, I would love to be back. Thanks for your time, man. I appreciate it.
All right, friends.
Cool.
We are out.